Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories, where the ancient world settles in for the evening, and old mysteries are allowed to speak a little more softly. Tonight, we are turning toward one of the strangest and most powerful guardian figures ever imagined in Mesopotamia, the Kusarikku, the bullman said to stand watch at the edges of sacred space, royal power, and divine order. It is not the sort of being most of us meet in everyday life, unless of course your neighbourhood is unusually well protected and someone has stationed a muscular human bull hybrid near the front gate. If so, I would be very interested to hear more. For most people, the ancient world arrives in pieces. A pyramid here, a ruined temple there, a king's name in a museum label, a monster half remembered from a school book, a winged figure carved in stone, a line from a myth that somehow survived thousands of years. But every so often, a figure appears that feels less like a decoration and more like a warning. Something planted at the edge of the known world, something made not to entertain, but to guard. The Kusarikku belongs to that category. It is one of those beings that makes you pause and wonder what kind of civilization imagined it so seriously, repeated it so carefully and placed it so deliberately. Before we go any further, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now. It always feels especially fitting to ask that at the beginning of these journeys, because while we're talking about beings from the deep past, we're all arriving here from very modern rooms, very different time zones, and very ordinary lives. Somewhere perhaps someone is listening under a blanket while rain taps at the window. Somewhere else someone has just finished a late meal and is letting the day finally loosen its grip. And somewhere, maybe, there is a person trying very hard to look calm while pretending not to be deeply interested in a Mesopotamian bullman. You are among friends here, no judgment. And if you find this kind of slow, curious wandering through the ancient world soothing, helpful, or simply a pleasant way to settle your thoughts before sleep, I would be very grateful if you left a like and subscribed. It helps this quiet corner of history reach other people who may also need a calmer place to end the day. Now then, get comfortable, let the noise of the modern world drift a little farther away, and together let us step toward the gates of old Mesopotamia, where stone, clay, ritual, and imagination joined forces to produce guardians that were never meant to be ignored. The Kusarikku is not as famous today as a sphinx, a griffin, or even the great winged bulls that often dominate museum halls. It does not always appear in popular retellings of Mesopotamian myth. It is not the creature most people would name first if asked about the strange beings of Iraq's ancient river civilizations, and yet that almost makes it more interesting. The figures that survive in the public imagination tend to do so because later cultures adopted them, simplified them, or turned them into symbols that travelled easily. The Kusarikku stayed closer to its original ground. It remained tied to the old cities, old rituals, old fears, and old hopes of the people who first imagined a guardian with the strength of a bull and the intelligence or posture of a man. That combination matters. In the ancient Near East, bulls were not casual animals in the imagination. They were not just livestock wandering about as background scenery. They were power made visible. They carried weight, force, fertility, stubbornness, and danger. A bull was not delicate. It was not uncertain. It pushed forward. It lowered its horns. It occupied space with complete confidence. When ancient people wanted to show raw strength, command, or virility, the bull was an obvious choice. At the same time, human form carried its own meaning. The human body suggested agency, awareness, intention, and participation in the world of decision and ritual. Blend the two together and you create something very pointed. Not just an animal, not just a man, but a being built to express force under control. And that is where the Kusarikku begins to feel less like a fantasy for its own sake and more like an answer to a problem. Ancient people lived with thresholds everywhere. The threshold of a temple, the threshold of a palace, the threshold between city and wilderness, the threshold between the protected and the exposed, the threshold between what belonged to the gods and what belonged to ordinary human life. Those boundaries had to be marked, defended, and made meaningful. A doorway was not simply a practical opening in a wall. It was a place where one realm gave way to another. It was where danger could enter. It was where order might fail. It was where the unseen could become a little too close. Modern life can make this hard to feel. We're used to locks, cameras, alarms, and passwords that reset themselves with a cheerful little email. We protect our homes with software updates, and our bank accounts with numbers no one can remember without looking in a notes app. But in the ancient world, protection was not just mechanical. It was symbolic, ritual, and visual. You did not merely close a door. You defended a boundary in every way you knew how. You used walls, yes, but also prayers, offerings, incantations, signs, amulets, and protective figures. You built security out of stone and belief at the same time. If you feared that illness, bad luck, hostile spirits, divine anger, envy, chaos, or enemy power might cross the boundary, then you set something there that said, very clearly, this place is watched. That is the kind of world in which the Kusarikku makes sense. Mesopotamia was full of such thinking. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers rose some of the earliest cities on Earth, cities that depended on fragile order. Their fields needed water, but too much water could destroy them. Their homes required walls, but walls could be broken. Their kings needed authority, but authority had to be constantly displayed and renewed. Their temples linked earth and heaven, but divine favour could not be taken for granted. Their daily existence was surrounded by uncertainty, and uncertainty has a way of making people very attentive to protection. So when we picture the Kusarikku, it helps not to think first in terms of modern fantasy creatures. This is not merely a character in an imaginative bestiary. It belongs to a system. It appears in a world where hybrid beings often served a serious function. Some protected, some threatened, some did both, depending on where they stood and who was looking at them. Ancient Mesopotamian art and ritual are crowded with figures that blur categories: human and animal, divine and monstrous, beautiful and unsettling. They were not confused about what they were doing. In many cases, blending forms was a way of concentrating qualities. If the lion carried one kind of power, the eagle another, the bull another, and the human form another, then bringing them together could produce a being more suited to guard the dangerous edges of reality than any ordinary creature could be. The Kusarikku seems to stand in that protective company. It is a guardian formed from symbolism that would have been immediately legible to the people who made and used it. They did not need a long explanatory plaque beside it. They saw strength. They saw vigilance. They saw a being capable of standing between forces, and that last part matters because the ancient Mesopotamian world was deeply concerned with forces. Not only armies, kings, and floods, but sickness, curses, demons, divine displeasure, and the general instability of life. Protection was a full-time concern. This is one reason the figure feels so compelling now. Even if we no longer share the full religious framework that gave the Kusarikku its original meaning, we still understand the emotional logic behind it. We still place things at thresholds. We still mark what matters. We still want the places we love to feel defended. A family hangs a symbol by the front door. A business installs a camera above the entrance. A nation places statues before government buildings. A child arranges stuffed animals near the bed as if some tiny plush army might keep the dark in order. People do not stop protecting themselves symbolically simply because they become modern. They just change materials. The Kusarikku also asks us to slow down and reconsider how ancient people used images. We are surrounded by pictures, logos, screens, icons, and designs so constant that they often become invisible. Most of what we see now is meant to attract attention just long enough to sell something, direct us somewhere, or keep us scrolling. In Mesopotamia, many images were doing heavier work. They carried religious meaning. They reinforced authority. They acted as warnings. They formed part of an environment designed to shape behaviour and direct thought. To place a guardian figure at an entrance was not merely to decorate architecture. It was to turn architecture into a statement. Imagine approaching a palace or temple and seeing not blank walls, but carefully placed beings who signalled, before you even stepped inside, that this was no casual space. Whatever happened beyond that point happened under watch. You were being reminded, visually and immediately, that power lived here, whether royal, divine, or both. It is difficult to overstate how effective that must have been. Human beings are very responsive to being looked at, even symbolically. A face, a stance, a fixed gaze, a powerful body, these things alter the emotional tone of a place. If the guardian was human enough to feel watchful and animal enough to feel dangerous, then all the better. There is also something revealing in the fact that the Kusarikku is not simply a brute beast. A bull alone would have conveyed strength, but not necessarily intelligence or directed purpose. A man alone would have conveyed awareness, but not the same raw weight. Together the fusion produces a figure that feels selected rather than accidental. It tells us that ancient Mesopotamians were not merely fascinated by strange creatures, they were deliberate symbol makers. They understood that combining forms could create concentrated meaning. And of course, behind the Kusarikku stands the larger world of the gods, the powers later remembered under names like the Anunnaki. That world was not neatly divided into pleasant divine beings on one side and frightening monsters on the other. The divine realm in Mesopotamian thought could be majestic, generous, punishing, distant, dangerous, protective, and absolutely serious about boundaries. If the gods had courts, temples, treasures, decrees, and sacred spaces, then it followed naturally that such spaces required guardians suited to their importance. A figure like the Kusarikku begins to feel less odd when placed there. Of course, powerful divine worlds would have attendants, protectors, or threshold beings that reflected strength beyond the ordinary. Of course, the people who served those gods would imagine guardians worthy of the task. Still, it is easy from a distance to flatten all of this into a single label and move on. Bullman, hybrid guardian, Mesopotamian protective figure. That sounds tidy, but tidy labels can make old ideas dull, and the Kusarikku is not dull. It belongs to a rich visual and ritual landscape where every detail may have carried weight. The posture mattered. The setting mattered. The material mattered. Whether the figure stood in art, incantation, relief, or carved threshold made a difference. Whether it appeared beside other guardian beings mattered too. Nothing in these old sacred environments was casual. The closer we look, the more it becomes clear that the Kusarikku was not simply an isolated curiosity, but part of a broader system for managing danger and expressing order. That broader system may be one reason the figure stayed powerful over time. Civilizations change, dynasties rise and fall, languages shift, empires conquer one another, and yet protective images have a stubborn habit of surviving, because the need behind them does not go away. People keep wanting signs that say, this place is defended, this house is watched, this king is supported, this temple is not open to disorder. The forms may change from age to age, but the instinct remains recognizable. We inherit it even now, though our guardians are often sleeker, quieter, and far less impressive in the horn department. There is another point worth dwelling on before we move deeper into the story. The ancient world did not sharply separate religion, politics, art, and daily life in the way modern people often do. A guardian figure could be religious and political at the same time. It could express cosmic order and royal authority in the same image. It could belong to ritual practice and architectural display together. This is important because when we ask what the Kusarikku was, we are not asking a small question. We are not only asking what creature it represented, We're asking what job it did in the mental and visual life of Mesopotamia. We're asking why people wanted to see it, invoke it, carve it, and place it at meaningful boundaries. We're asking what fear it answered and what promise it made. That promise, at least in broad terms, seems straightforward. The promise was that strength stood ready, that chaos was not unopposed, that the doorway, the sacred precinct, the king's domain, or the divine threshold was not left exposed to whatever might come out of the dark. There is comfort in that idea, even when it arrives in a form that is a little intimidating. In fact, perhaps especially then. Gentle things do not always reassure us when the threat feels serious. Sometimes reassurance needs horns, and so tonight, as we begin this long walk through the world of the Kusarikku, it helps to carry a few things with us. First, that this is a guardian, not a random oddity. Second, that ancient Mesopotamians used hybrid forms with purpose, not confusion. Third, that the bull and the human together created a concentrated image of power, control and presence. And fourth, that to understand the Kusarikku properly, we must place it back where it belonged, in a civilization deeply concerned with protection, sacred boundaries, divine order, and the visible display of unseen power. That is where the figure starts to come alive again, not as a museum footnote, not as an exotic curiosity, not as a strange doodle from the distant past, but as something that once stood for real in the minds of the people who made it, something that watched, something that warned, something that belonged at the edge between safety and danger. And once we have taken that first step, once we have stood a moment before the threshold and let the outline of the bullman settle into view, the next question begins to press forward naturally, because before we can understand why the Kusarikku guarded the world of gods and kings, we need to look more closely at what this being was actually said to be, and why its form would have been immediately understood in the ancient Mesopotamian mind. So once the outline of the bullman is standing there in our minds, the next thing to do is stop treating it like a vague, mythic silhouette and ask a much more practical question. What exactly was the Kusarikku supposed to be? That sounds simple, but with ancient Mesopotamian beings, simple questions tend to open into larger rooms. A modern reader wants a neat answer, something short and satisfying. Was it a god, a demon, a monster, a servant, a symbol, a guardian, or some artistic invention that drifted from place to place without ever meaning one fixed thing? The trouble is that Mesopotamia did not always sort beings into the same tidy boxes we like to use now. The world of its temples, myths, protective rituals, royal art and learned texts was crowded with figures that crossed categories. Some beings were not worshipped in the way major gods were, yet they still belonged to the divine or supernatural order. Some could appear threatening in form while serving a protective function. Some were invoked in ritual as defenders against worse things. Some stood close to the gods without being gods in the highest sense themselves. The Kusarikku seems to live in that territory. At the most basic level, the name points us toward a bullman, a being in which the strength and identity of the bull had been fused with the upright form or active nature of a human. That much gives us a clear starting point, but not yet the full picture. Ancient Mesopotamian hybrid beings were rarely random mixtures. They were not the result of somebody one afternoon deciding to combine two creatures simply because it looked unusual. They were built from meaning. A bull was power, force, masculine energy, stubborn forward movement, physical danger, and at times royal or divine authority. A human figure suggested intelligence, agency, task, intention, and participation in the ordered world of ritual and rule. Bring those qualities together and the result is not a farm animal that learned to stand up, but a concentrated guardian form. In some depictions from the broader Mesopotamian world, the bullman appears as a muscular human figure joined with the lower body or features of a bull, sometimes with horns, sometimes with a distinctly powerful hybrid posture that leaves no doubt that the being is meant to be more than ordinary. Even when the exact visual details vary across time and context, the effect is consistent. This is not a soft domestic figure. It does not exist to comfort in the modern sentimental sense. It exists to convey that something strong has been stationed where strength is needed. It does not merely inhabit a scene, it secures it, and that tells us something important about how ancient people likely understood the Kusarikku. They would not have looked at the figure and wondered first whether it belonged in fantasy literature. They would have understood it as part of a serious visual language. Mesopotamia was a civilization that knew very well that appearances mattered. Palaces, temples, gates, boundary stones, seals, reliefs, ritual objects, and incantation traditions all used images to declare who held power and what kind of forces were active. If a hybrid guardian stood there, then it stood there for a reason. There is also the matter of where such beings were imagined to belong. The Kusarikku was not simply a creature of the open field, wandering like some accidental oddity between the reeds and the riverbanks. It belonged much more naturally to thresholds, divine environments, ritual systems, and protective settings. That is one of the clearest clues to its character. Mesopotamia, as we have already begun to see, was deeply invested in guarding spaces. A home was vulnerable, a palace was vulnerable, a temple was vulnerable, a city gate was vulnerable. The boundary between the safe interior and the dangerous outside was never just a practical line. It was charged. It was where trouble entered. It was where the unseen had to be kept at bay. A being like the Kusarikku made sense there because its body itself seemed to announce resistance. When ancient texts and traditions describe or imply protective beings, the point is not always to give us a modern-style encyclopedia entry. The point is often functional. What does the being do? Where does it stand? What does it oppose? What quality does it embody? In that respect, the Kusarikku seems less like a narrative character with a dramatic personal backstory, and more like a specialized presence within the larger sacred and protective world of Mesopotamia. That does not make it less interesting. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. It shows us what ancient people thought a guardian needed to be. Apparently, one answer was this: a guardian should be more than human. Not because humans were worthless, but because humans were limited. A door guarded by an ordinary man could fail. A city wall held only by soldiers could fall. A temple defended only by locks and bricks would still remain vulnerable to curses, ill fortune, hostile supernatural forces, and the ever-present possibility that order might be breached. A hybrid guardian solved that problem at the level of symbolism. It was stronger than a man, more watchful than an animal, and more fitting for divine or royal service than either one alone. The bull side of the Kusarikku is especially worth lingering over, because bulls mattered a great deal across the ancient Near East. They were not neutral creatures. They carried prestige. They could be associated with storm gods, kingship, virility, and violent energy. A bull lowered its head, and nobody in the ancient world needed an explanation of what came next. To attach that power to a protective being was to draw from a deep and recognizable reservoir of meaning. This was a form people respected because the animal itself demanded respect. The ancient viewer would not have needed to be told that a bull was formidable. The body already said it. But why not just use a bull then? Why add the human element at all? That question leads us to something central. The human element made the being purposeful. A bull may charge, but a guardian must do more than charge. A guardian must stand, attend, watch, belong to a place, and serve an order. Human shape implies assigned duty. It implies that the power has been directed. There is intention in it. The Kusarikku is not only strong, it is stationed strength. This becomes even more meaningful when we place the being beside the world of the Anunnaki and the wider Mesopotamian divine order. Later, modern retellings often use the word Anunnaki very loosely. sometimes turning it into a catch-all label for every mysterious thing in Mesopotamian culture. The ancient picture was more grounded and more specific. The gods formed a ranked, complex, serious world of authority, cosmic responsibility, judgment, creation, destruction, and divine household structure. If there were sacred courts, sacred houses, sacred thresholds, and divine domains, then the presence of guardian beings is not surprising at all. In fact, it would almost be expected. A powerful world requires attendants and defenders suited to its power. The Kusarikku, then, may be understood as part of that environment of divine service and supernatural protection. Not the highest god seated on the throne, but one of the figures that made the throne room safe. Not the ruler issuing the decree, but the being who made sure disorder thought twice before coming through the entrance. There is something practical about that role, and practical roles often survive because they are useful in many settings. A guardian can serve temple symbolism, palace symbolism, ritual magic, and visual theology all at once. This is also why the line between guardian and monster can be misleading for us. In modern storytelling, monsters are usually the threat. Guardians are usually the defenders. The ancient world was not always so strict about the visual difference between the two. A being could look fearsome precisely because it was meant to frighten harmful forces. It could be unsettling to humans while still operating on behalf of human protection. In fact, that may have been part of the point. Something harmless does not frighten a demon. Something gentle does not necessarily impress chaos. If you wanted a threshold guarded, you placed there an image that looked capable of doing unpleasant things to whatever tried to cross uninvited. This kind of logic still survives in diluted form. Nations place great stone lions outside official buildings. Sports teams choose predators and beasts as mascots, not sleepy rabbits and apologetic goats. Families install sharp fences rather than decorative lines of pudding. When people want to signal defense, they reach for forceful imagery. Mesopotamia simply did it with more mythic confidence. The Kusarikku also fits into a larger pattern of hybrid beings in Mesopotamian art and ritual, which helps us understand that it was not an isolated invention. The ancient viewer likely recognized it as one member of a protective and symbolic world that included other mixed-form beings, each carrying its own role and qualities. Some combined human and lion features, others human and bird, others full composite forms that gathered several powers at once. What these beings share is not random strangeness but specialization. Each is like a tool shaped for a particular sacred job. The Kusarikku was the bull man because the task required bull strength directed by conscious presence. There is something almost administrative about that. Mesopotamia loved order. That does not mean life there was neat or peaceful. It was often fragile, dangerous, and unstable. But the response to instability was not shrugging acceptance. It was systems. Systems of writing, law, labour, offering, kingship, astronomy, ritual, omen reading, city defence, agriculture, and divine service. Protective figures belonged to that same world of organised response. You did not simply hope that evil would stay away. You named it, classified it, addressed it, and placed defenders against it. The Kusarikku belongs to a civilization that took the management of danger seriously. Because of that, the being was probably understood less as an individual personality and more as a category of presence. This is an important distinction. Modern audiences often search for biography. We want a story arc, a dramatic origin, a betrayal, a triumph, perhaps a complicated childhood if possible. But not every ancient being was built for narrative in that way. Some existed primarily as powers, functions, or roles. The Kusarikku may have been one of those. That does not reduce it, it clarifies it. The bullman did not need a tragic backstory in order to stand at the gate. It needed authority, and authority in the Mesopotamian sense was never just physical. It was also sacred. The visual world of ancient Iraq did not separate religious meaning from protective architecture and royal message-making. A guardian being outside a palace told you something about the king. A guardian being near sacred space told you something about divine order. A protective figure in an incantation told you something about how the unseen world was being managed. The Kusarikku could move across those meanings, because all of them belonged to the same larger understanding of reality. The world was layered, and protection had to work across layers too. This may be why the figure still feels memorable now. There is an honesty to it. The Kusarikku does not pretend that safety is effortless. It does not suggest that order simply maintains itself. It says, more or less, that the good things of the world need guarding, and the guard should look ready. That is an old idea and a durable one. It is also possible that part of the Kusarikku's force came from its position between categories. Human but not human, animal but not animal, familiar enough to read, strange enough to command attention. Hybrid beings do something powerful to the mind because they interrupt normal sorting. The brain likes quick decisions. Human, animal, safe, dangerous, known, unknown. A hybrid slows that process down. It forces attention. It asks for interpretation. In a protective context, that is useful. The more fixed the gaze, the more effective the sign. A doorway becomes more memorable when the thing beside it is not easily dismissed. And perhaps that is another part of what the Kusarikku was said to be. Not merely a creature, but a warning. A visible statement that this boundary mattered. A reminder that what lay beyond was not ordinary. A signal that sacred, royal or protected order was already present before you crossed the line. In that sense, the bullman was not only guarding the threshold, it was helping create it. A threshold becomes more real when it's marked, watched, and given form. There is a practical elegance to that idea. Ancient Mesopotamians were great builders of symbolic environments. They knew that the experience of a place began before one entered it. A temple was not just its inner room. A palace was not just the king's chair. The approach mattered. The gate mattered. The outer signs mattered. The Kusarikku belongs to that outer zone where meaning begins to gather and where the visitor starts to understand that they are entering a space governed by more than ordinary rules. So when we ask what the Kusarikku was said to be, the fullest answer may sound something like this. It was a bullman guardian, a supernatural protective figure formed from the concentrated meanings of bull power and human agency. It belonged to the symbolic and ritual world of Mesopotamia, where hybrid beings defended boundaries, sacred places, and ordered life against both visible and invisible threats. It was not merely decorative, not merely monstrous, and not merely a tale for entertainment. It was a serious image in a serious civilization, shaped to stand at the line between danger and control. That line, of course, leads us somewhere else. Once we understand that the Kusarikku was not random and not alone, a new question starts to press closer. Why did Mesopotamia imagine so many beings that combined animal and human qualities in the first place? And what did that say about the way its people thought about power, protection, and the forms a guardian ought to take? If the Kusarikku feels strange to us now, that is partly because we are meeting it from the wrong side of history. We meet it in photographs, museum labels, fragments of relief, and reconstructed ideas. We meet it after centuries of distance, after the old temples went quiet, after the languages changed, after the rituals stopped being performed by the people who once knew exactly why such a being belonged at a gate. For them, the bullman was not a bizarre thought experiment. It made sense inside a larger habit of mind, a larger way of looking at danger, power, and protection. And if we want to understand why Mesopotamia imagined guardians born between beast and human, we need to step into that habit of mind for a while and let it do its work. One useful place to begin is with a simple observation. Ancient Mesopotamia was not interested in neat categories for their own sake. It was interested in useful ones. The modern world likes clean labels: human, animal, natural, supernatural, religious, political, decorative, practical. We tend to divide the world into shelves and feel relieved when everything sits where it should. Mesopotamia could do classification very well, of course. This was a civilization of lists, records, omen series, administrative tablets, tax accounts, law codes, and trained scribes who wrote things down with a seriousness that still impresses people 5,000 years later. But when it came to sacred power, protection, and the invisible forces woven into life, the world was not tidy in that modern way. It was layered, active, and full of overlap. That matters because hybrid guardians are an answer to overlap. If danger comes in many forms, then protection also has to be more than one thing at once. A purely human guard may be watchful but weak. A purely animal one may be strong but limited. A divine figure may be too distant or too exalted for every threshold. But a composite being can gather qualities. It can combine strength, intelligence, watchfulness, ferocity, sacred authority, and visual impact in a single form. In other words, it can do more work at once. There is something very practical about that. Ancient Mesopotamians lived in a world where the visible and invisible were never far apart. A city had walls and gates, yes, but it also had curses, omens, divine favour, sickness, enemy kings, unlucky signs, malicious forces, and the ever-present fear that order could fray. A palace might look solid in mud, brick and stone, but solidity alone was not enough. A temple could have priests, offerings and rituals, but that did not remove the need for protection. To modern ears, this can sound superstitious, as though people simply imagined dangers everywhere because they lacked science. But that reading misses the point. They understood vulnerability because they lived with it constantly. Floods came, crops failed, illness spread, armies arrived, dynasties fell, children died. The heavens were watched for warning signs because life could turn quickly. In that kind of world, guarding the threshold was not dramatic excess. It was common sense. Once you see that, hybrid guardians stop looking eccentric and begin to look efficient. They were also visually efficient. Mesopotamian art did not waste meaning when it came to important beings. The body of a creature mattered. Horns mattered. Wings mattered. Claws, beards, posture, and the direction of a gaze all mattered. Ancient viewers were not wandering through these visual worlds thinking, "That looks odd." Perhaps the sculptor was experimenting. They were reading. They knew that a lion suggested one set of qualities, an eagle another, a bull another, a human figure another. When these were blended, the blend was meaningful. It was a way of compressing power into form. The bullman fits directly into that logic. Bulls were already charged animals in the ancient Near East. They represented force, virility, pressure, agricultural value, and a kind of unstoppable momentum. A bull was not merely large livestock. It was an animal people respected because it could injure, dominate, and overwhelm. It also connected symbolically to kingship and divine strength in a wider cultural sense. The human figure, by contrast, signalled intention, duty, action, and ordered agency. So when Mesopotamia imagined a guardian that was both bull and man, it was not blurring categories because it was confused. It was selecting categories because it knew exactly what each one brought to the job. And the job, most of the time, was not storytelling in the modern sense. Hybrid guardians are often flattened now into mythical creatures, as though they existed mainly to populate old tales. But many of them belonged not first to story, but to function. They stood, watched, protected, marked, warned, and signalled. That is why they appear so naturally in sacred and royal spaces. A being like the Kusarikku did not need a dramatic dialogue scene to justify its existence. Its body was already a statement. Its placement was already a message. Its presence told you this boundary mattered. There is another reason Mesopotamia was especially fertile ground for such beings, and that is the structure of its sacred imagination. The Mesopotamian cosmos was not empty between humans and the highest gods. It was crowded. Major deities ruled and judged, yes, but around them moved attendants, intermediaries, lesser beings, protective figures, destructive forces, demons, gatekeepers, divine servants, and specialized entities attached to places, functions, and powers. The old world was not imagined as a simple ladder with gods above and humans below. It was more like an administration of reality, busy, layered, and deeply concerned with who belonged where. That kind of cosmos naturally produces guardians. Think of it almost as celestial staffing. If there are divine houses, then there are guardians. If there are sacred chambers, there are keepers of access. If there are dangerous thresholds, there are beings built for those thresholds. If there are forces that threaten order, then the powers of order need visible and invisible defenders. In that sense, hybrid guardians are exactly what you would expect from a civilization that imagined the universe as structured, ruled, and constantly requiring maintenance. That last word is useful. Maintenance. Mesopotamian civilization spent enormous effort maintaining things. Irrigation channels had to be managed, city walls had to be repaired, offerings had to be given, calendars had to be observed, kingship had to be justified, rituals had to be performed correctly, omens had to be interpreted, scribes had to copy and preserve knowledge. The world did not simply hold together by itself. It was labour, repeated action, proper order, and careful attention all the way down. Hybrid guardians belong to that same mentality. They are maintenance in visual form. They announce that someone is minding the boundary. This helps explain why such figures are often intimidating rather than pleasant. Modern people sometimes imagine protection should look comforting, in a nursery perhaps, in a sacred doorway meant to warn chaos that it is not welcome, not so much. The ancient mind was not asking whether a guardian seemed cuddly. It was asking whether it looked capable. A protective being had to be fearsome enough to discourage what it opposed. The result is a world of guardians that can look severe, composite, and a little unsettling. That unsettling quality is not a flaw, it is part of the point. In fact, it may have been especially useful because hybrid forms force the viewer to pause. A simple bull is one thing, a simple human is another. A bullman interrupts ordinary recognition. Your eye catches. Your mind registers that this is not common life. Something more than normal force is present here. That moment of hesitation matters at a threshold. It changes how a person approaches the space. It heightens seriousness. It tells visitors, worshippers, rivals, petitioners, and perhaps even unseen threats, that the entrance is not naked and undefended. A good guardian also has to belong equally to two worlds. That may be the deepest reason hybrid forms made sense. Animals embodied raw powers humans admired and feared. Humans embodied control, intention, tool use, speech, ritual, and social order. Guardians had to stand between natural force and ordered civilization. They had to be close enough to humanity to serve its spaces, yet powerful enough to exceed humanity. A hybrid body solved that problem elegantly. It made visible a being that could bridge what ordinary bodies could not. Mesopotamia did this not only with bullmen, but with a wider population of composite protectors. Some combined human and lion traits, some bird and human features, some multiple animal powers at once. Each form selected its own symbolic equipment. This larger family of beings tells us something important. The Kusarikku was not a one-off burst of imagination. It belonged to a standard way of thinking. The Mesopotamian world believed that mixed forms could express concentrated truths about power. Just as a king's robe, crown, weapon, and throne each signalled aspects of authority, so too could a guardian's body signal aspects of protection. And there is something deeply reasonable in that, even now. We still combine symbols to make messages stronger. A national emblem might blend eagle wings, shields, stars, and weapons. A university crest might combine animals, books, torches, and crowns. A modern company logo often compresses an entire identity into a few shapes, because the mind reads combinations quickly. Mesopotamia was doing something similar, only with much more religious seriousness and a far stronger sense that images participated in the work they represented. That participation is easy to miss if we think ancient images were merely decorative. In many Mesopotamian contexts, an image was not passive. It could protect, represent, invoke, and reinforce. It belonged to ritual action and sacred environment. This is one reason hybrid guardians were not simply illustrations of beliefs. They were part of how belief operated in space. A carved guardian at a threshold did not merely remind people of protection. It helped create a protected threshold by marking it visibly and symbolically. The line between representation and function was thinner than modern people often assume. Once we accept that, hybrid guardians become much more understandable. Mesopotamia did not imagine them because it had a taste for weird creatures in the abstract. It imagined them because such beings solved religious, political, and psychological needs all at once. They made authority visible. They gave architecture presence. They warned enemies, both human and supernatural. They translated invisible protection into something the eyes could grasp. They also fit perfectly into a worldview where power itself was mixed, layered, and never wholly confined to one category. Even kingship in Mesopotamia was like that. A king was human, but his office was not merely human. He ruled with divine sanction, ritual obligation, military force, legal responsibility, and public display. A palace was a residence, but also an administrative machine, a ceremonial centre, and a symbol of order. A temple was a building, but also a house of a god, a storehouse, a political actor, and a sacred meeting point between realms. Everything important was already more than one thing. So why would its guardians be simple? There may also be a more psychological reason. Human beings are drawn to images that gather our fears and hopes into manageable form. Danger in everyday life is vague. It can come from disease, envy, bad weather, violence, accident, bad decisions, or things you never even saw coming. To answer that vagueness, cultures often produce figures that give danger and defense a shape. In Mesopotamia, hybrid guardians did that work beautifully. They took the abstract need for safety and turned it into a body with muscle, stance, and authority. You could place it at a door. You could carve it in stone. You could include it in ritual knowledge. You could point to it and say, "This place is not undefended." That does not mean everyone in Mesopotamia sat around feeling equally reassured by bullmen and winged guardians. Ancient societies contained doubt, routine, habit, boredom, and ordinary practical life just like any other. A gatekeeper may have passed the same carved protector every day without writing poetry about it. But repetition itself matters. The more often such figures appeared at important places, the more they normalized the idea that order should be visibly guarded by beings larger than ordinary life. Over time, that creates a habit of expectation. Of course, sacred space has protectors. Of course, royal authority has guardian forms. Of course, important thresholds are marked by beings designed to warn. There is also a political side to all this. A hybrid guardian protected more than one kind of boundary. It protected sacred order, yes, but it also reinforced royal messaging. If a palace entrance is flanked by beings of immense symbolic force, then anyone approaching is already being instructed in how to feel. The ruler inside is not merely a man with paperwork. He's attached to a protected order backed by divine power, visual power, and inherited tradition. You are entering a place that presents itself as secure, legitimate, and serious. In that sense, the guardian is doing public relations at a terrifyingly high standard. And yet the most interesting thing about Mesopotamian hybrid guardians is that they never feel purely political or purely religious. They sit right in the overlap. That is why they endure in memory. They are not cold symbols, they feel alive with purpose. A lion man, a winged bull, a bull man. These are forms that suggest not just rule, but readiness. Not just order, but defended order. Not just beauty, but useful beauty. The imagination that produced them was disciplined. It used fantasy in the service of control. All of this helps us see why a figure like the Kusarikku was imaginable in the first place. It came from a culture that respected boundaries, feared disorder, organised sacred life carefully, read meaning into bodies and animals, and believed that unseen power needed visible companions. The bullman was born not from confusion between beast and human, but from confidence that a guardian could and should be made from both. The animal side supplied force, the human side supplied directed service. The hybrid body made those qualities permanent and unmistakable, and once such beings existed in the symbolic vocabulary of Mesopotamia, they became part of a larger protective world. A person approaching sacred or royal space would not see them as shocking inventions each time, but as known members of a guarded landscape. They belonged there. They answered a need people understood. They did not ask the viewer to admire their originality. They asked the viewer to respect the threshold. That threshold, in the end, may be the key to the whole matter. Mesopotamian life was built around thresholds of every kind. River and field, city and desert, house and street, human and divine, king and subject, order and chaos, life and death. Good guardians belong at thresholds because thresholds are where change happens and where control can fail. A hybrid guardian is especially suited to such places because it is itself a threshold made flesh. It stands between categories, just as it stands between dangers. It is neither one thing nor the other, because the place it serves is also neither one thing nor the other. A door is still wall and already opening. A temple gate is still city and already God's house. A palace threshold is still street and already royal centre. The guardian mirrors the place. So when the Kusarikku appears, it is appearing exactly where Mesopotamian thought would have wanted it to appear, at the meeting point between force and order, animal power and human purpose, fear and defence, outside and inside. And once we understand why that hybrid form made sense in the minds of the people who imagined it, the next step becomes clearer, because now we can look more closely at the parts themselves, at the horn and the hand, the body of the bull and the stance of the man, and ask what each side of the Kusarikku was meant to say when ancient eyes fell upon it. To understand why the Kusarikku mattered, it helps to stop looking at it as one finished creature for a moment, and instead pull it apart into its two main elements. On one side there is the bull, on the other there is the man. Neither half was chosen casually. Ancient Mesopotamia did not build protective beings by throwing symbols together and hoping they looked impressive. The people who carved, described, invoked, and placed figures like this were very good at visual meaning. They knew that bodies could speak. They knew that animals carried reputations. They knew that posture, horns, muscles, and human form could deliver a message before a single prayer was spoken. And the message of the Kusarikku begins with this simple idea. The bull brought force, and the man brought control. That may sound straightforward, but in the ancient world, straightforward things were often the most powerful. A bull was not a decorative thought. It was one of the clearest signs of physical power available to people living close to animals, agriculture, and the daily realities of labour and danger. Bulls pulled, pushed, charged, and dominated. They were useful, but they were never soft symbols of usefulness. They were valuable because they were strong, and strength in ancient life was not an optional extra. It was survival. A society built on fields, herds, transport, construction, and conflict would not have needed anyone to explain why the bull mattered. The animal itself had already done the explaining. There is a tendency in modern life to forget how immediate that kind of animal symbolism once was. Most people now meet bulls as logos, cartoon mascots, photographs, or perhaps at a safe distance behind a fence with several warning signs, and a farmer who looks as though he's had enough nonsense for one lifetime. Ancient Mesopotamians lived much closer to the reality behind the image. They knew the weight of large animals. They knew what horns could do. They knew the difference between a creature that simply occupied space and one that could decide, very suddenly, that the space belonged to it. When a bull lowered its head, nobody thought of metaphor first. They thought of impact. So when the bull entered the form of the Kusarikku, it brought with it a reputation already earned in the real world. This mattered because protective beings need believable power. A guardian that looks weak does not reassure. A threshold figure that appears decorative rather than forceful does not change how people feel when they approach a gate or a sacred entrance. The bull solved that problem immediately. It gave the Kusarikku weight before anyone even thought about its human side. It said that this was not a passive figure. It said that if resistance were needed, resistance would be available in large quantities. But the bull meant more than raw force. In the wider ancient Near East, bulls were also tied to status, virility, kingship, storm power, and divine energy. They were not merely muscular animals. They carried prestige. Their strength was admired, feared, and associated with forces beyond ordinary domestic life. A bull could symbolize male potency, aggressive energy, dominance, and command. In some religious and royal contexts, the animal became part of a wide language of authority. That is important because the Kusarikku was not guarding a random patch of countryside. It belonged to spaces where sacred order, political power, and social hierarchy mattered. The bull's symbolism therefore did double duty. It was physically intimidating, yes, but it was also socially and cosmically impressive. And then there are the horns. It is difficult to overstate how much horns can improve the credibility of a guardian. They are one of nature's less subtle design features. Claws can be hidden. Teeth may only appear when something has already gone wrong. Horns, by contrast, announce the problem in advance. They are visible warnings. They turn the head itself into a weapon. In visual symbolism, that matters a great deal. Horns suggest readiness, even in stillness. A horned being does not need to be shown charging to seem dangerous. The possibility is built into the outline. In Mesopotamian visual culture, horns could also carry divine or exalted significance. Horned crowns and headdresses are well known in depictions of gods and godlike authority. Even where a bullman guardian is not simply a god in the highest sense, the presence of horns naturally pulls the figure upward in status. Horns say that this being belongs to a realm of heightened power. They make it harder to read the figure as merely animal. They elevate it, they sharpen it, they place it closer to the world of beings who do not answer to ordinary rules. That is the bull side. Force, danger, prestige, momentum, dominance, visible warning, and a body built to mean business. If the Kusarikku had only that, it would already be formidable. But it would not yet be ideal as a guardian. Strength by itself can be reckless. A bull can charge, but a guardian must do more than charge. A guardian must remain at a post. It must watch. It must represent. It must hold a line, belong to an order, and serve a purpose greater than its own power. That is where the human side enters. The man in the Kusarikku is not just a convenient extra pair of arms. He is the principle of intention. Human form in the ancient symbolic world brought with it intelligence, awareness, directed action, and duty. The human body is the body that builds, speaks, judges, performs ritual, carries tools, obeys commands, and serves institutions. It belongs to the organized world. If the bull suggests power in the natural and instinctive sense, the man suggests that power has been harnessed. This is a crucial point, because Mesopotamian civilization valued harnessed power more than power left to itself. Floodwater is powerful, but it must be channeled. Armies are powerful, but they must be led. Kings are powerful, but they must rule within divine order and ritual legitimacy. Labour is powerful, but it must be organised. The same mentality appears in protective beings. It is not enough that a guardian be strong. The guardian must be stationed strength, directed strength, strength that knows whom it serves and where it stands. Human form also adds something else to the Kusarikku, and that is social legibility. People know how to read human posture. We are very good at it. We understand stance, readiness, watchfulness, and command almost instantly. A human chest squared toward the world, a lifted head, an alert face, a firm set of shoulders. These things signal attention and control. The body of the man makes the guardian feel assigned rather than wild. It tells the viewer that this is not a beast that wandered in. This is a figure with a role. That role matters, especially in the environments where the Kusarikku would have had meaning. At a gate, in a ritual setting, near a sacred threshold, or within the visual world of the gods and kings, the guardian has to feel like part of the system. The human component gives it that quality. It can belong to an entrance the way an officer belongs to a post. It can serve a temple the way an appointed attendant serves a divine house. It can stand in ordered relation to architecture. It can participate in the world of duties. Bulls alone do not have duties in that sense. Humans do. So by blending the two, Mesopotamian imagination created not just a powerful being, but an accountable one. There is also the question of hands. Hands are easy to overlook because we live with them constantly. But in symbolic terms, they are remarkable things. Hands grasp, hold, point, bless, protect, strike, build, and perform ritual acts. They are instruments of deliberate intervention. A horn can wound, but a hand can control. A hand can open a door, raise a weapon, present an offering, or signal authority. If the bull contributes unstoppable physicality, the hand contributes manipulation and purpose. Together, horn and hand tell a complete story. One says that force exists. The other says that force can be applied intelligently. This is part of why the Kusarikku feels so much more effective than a purely animal guardian would have been. A purely animal guardian might seem fierce, but it would still belong mainly to the natural world. The human element lifts the creature into the world of culture, religion, and power structures. It joins force to order. It makes the being suitable for gates, palaces, divine spaces, and the symbolic defense of civilization itself. Ancient Mesopotamia was full of efforts to hold order against disorder, whether in the shape of enemies, illness, curses, bad omens, or hostile supernatural presence. The human half of the Kusarikku tells us that the guardian is not just part of the problem of power, it is part of the solution. There may also be a deeper emotional logic at work here. Human beings trust human signals. We are unsettled by faces, reassured by posture, and deeply attentive to being watched. A bull alone can frighten, but a human-like guardian can watch. That matters. This sense of being watched changes behaviour. A doorway with a powerful animal may impress. A doorway with a powerful human-animal guardian feels supervised. It implies judgment. It suggests that entry is noticed. That combination is psychologically stronger than either element alone, and so the Kusarikku becomes more than a sum of parts. The bull is not merely attached to the man, and the man is not merely riding the bull in some awkward symbolic arrangement. The two are merged because each completes what the other lacks. The bull contributes power that cannot easily be challenged. The man contributes order that can be trusted to stay in place. The bull is threat. The man is assignment. The bull is momentum. The man is stance. The bull says, "Do not push past this line." The man says this line exists for a reason. That becomes even more interesting when we think about how ancient viewers might have encountered the figure. They were not doing an academic exercise in comparative mythology. They were approaching meaningful spaces in which images work together. A guardian's body would have been read quickly, even if not analytically. People understood animals because animals shaped life. They understood human rank and bearing because hierarchy shaped life too. The Kusarikku compressed both of those recognitions into one body. That compression is what gave it power. It made the symbolic message immediate. There is, however, one more thing the human side contributes, and it may be the most important of all. The human side makes service possible. This is easy to miss because modern people often admire power for its own sake. Ancient Mesopotamia did not. It admired power in relation to order. Gods had roles, kings had obligations, priests had duties, scribes had functions. Even destructive forces were classified and addressed within systems of knowledge and ritual. A guardian had to belong to that world of assignment. It was not enough for it to be frightening. It had to be useful. Human form made usefulness visible. It implied a being that could stand in service to the Anunnaki, to sacred architecture, to ritual boundaries, to the protected spaces of kings and gods. The bull side, then, may tell us what kind of power the guardian possessed, but the human side tells us whom the guardian belonged to. It turns power into service. That is a very Mesopotamian move. This was a civilization deeply concerned with who served whom, who was appointed where, what was owed, what was protected, and what happened when proper order broke down. The Kusarikku reflects that mentality exactly. It is not chaos wearing muscles. It is controlled force placed under authority. That point also helps explain why a being like this could feel impressive rather than merely monstrous. Modern audiences often hear Bullman and think first of the bizarre. But to an ancient eye, the combination might have felt less bizarre than effective. If bulls were strong and men could serve, then a bullman could serve strongly. It is almost practical in its own symbolic way. A little dramatic, certainly, but ancient architecture did not mind being dramatic when important boundaries were involved. It is worth remembering, too, that Mesopotamian thought was full of mixed forms, because the world it described was full of mixed demands. A protective being needed to be fierce enough to oppose danger, and civilized enough to belong to sacred order. It needed to be impressive to the human eye and appropriate to divine environments. It had to stand at a threshold, which is itself a mixed space, neither fully outside nor fully inside. The bull and the man each speak to one side of that work. Together they become a body designed for the threshold itself. Even the contrast between animal and human would have strengthened the effect. Human beings are used to sorting the world quickly. This is a person. This is a beast. This is safe. This is dangerous. A hybrid disrupts that easy sorting. It commands attention. It makes the viewer pause. In a protective setting, that pause is useful. It gives the guardian an extra layer of force, because it works not only through symbolism, but through interruption. It refuses to become background. It keeps the threshold charged. The more we look at the Kusarikku this way, the clearer it becomes that the figure was built from deliberate choices. The horns were not there just to make it look wild. They signalled offensive capability, prestige, and a kind of sacred intensity. The body of the bull was not there just to look heavy. It brought unstoppable physical power into the image. The human upper form, or active human traits, were not there just to make the creature look clever. They turned power into presence, duty, and watchfulness. The hands suggested control. The stance suggested assignment. Everything pointed toward one task: guard this place. And because the place mattered, the being had to matter too. That is, perhaps, the simplest and strongest way to say it. The bull side told ancient viewers that the guardian had the strength to resist intrusion. The human side told them the guardian had the awareness and purpose to stand where it was needed. One half promised force, the other promised order. One half said no one gets through lightly. The other half said this defense belongs to a larger system, and in a world of temples, palaces, divine authority, protective ritual, and constant concern for vulnerable boundaries, that was exactly the combination a threshold guardian required. So, when the Kusarikku stood before the imagination of Mesopotamia, it stood as more than a strange creature from a distant mythology. It stood as a lesson in how the ancient world thought about power. Real power was not merely the ability to crush, it was the ability to hold, to watch, to remain, to serve what had been marked as important. It was strength put in its proper place. and once that place comes into view, once horn and hand have each said their part, the next step is almost waiting for us already, because a guardian like this was not made to stand nowhere in particular. It belonged somewhere very specific, at entrances, at boundaries, at the edges of spaces claimed by divine and royal order, which means the next thing to ask is where exactly the Kusarikku stood watch, and what it meant to place the bullman at the gates of the gods. Once we know what the Kusarikku was made of, the next question almost asks itself, what was a being like that for in practical terms? Not just in the broad symbolic sense, but in the actual spaces of ancient Mesopotamian life. Where did a bullman guardian belong? What kind of place called for that much concentrated force, that much warning, that much visible seriousness? And the answer, again and again, leads us toward gates, thresholds, entrances, and the edges of spaces that were too important to leave unguarded. That is one of the most useful things to remember about the ancient world. Importance had geography. It was not floating around in abstract ideas. It lived in buildings, courtyards, temple precincts, palace halls, storerooms, sacred platforms, processional ways, city walls, and doorways crossed by real feet. A god's house was somewhere. A king's audience chamber was somewhere. A protected room was somewhere. The places that mattered most were not simply marked by being built larger than other places. They were marked by how one approached them, how one entered them, what signs stood before them, and what kind of atmosphere gathered at the point of crossing. That point of crossing is where the Kusarikku begins to feel fully at home. A threshold in Mesopotamia was never just a line between one room and another. It was a vulnerable point. It was where separation became contact. It was where an outside became an inside. It was where a visitor became a guest, or a stranger became a possible threat. It was where ordinary space gave way to protected space. If the room beyond belonged to a god, then the threshold mattered even more. If it belonged to a king, it mattered in another way. If it belonged to both divine and royal order at once, then the threshold became charged with the full seriousness of the civilization. Modern people still understand this more than they sometimes realise. We may not bury protective figurines in walls or carve hybrid beings beside sacred entrances very often, though interior design would certainly become more memorable if we did. But we still distinguish entrances. A front door is not the same as a back fence. A courthouse entrance is not the same as a market stall. A cathedral door is not the same as a garage. The point where you enter a place tells you what sort of place it is. We use materials, signs, guards, steps, lighting, locks, and symbols to do that work. Mesopotamia did the same, only with a much stronger sense that the boundary also needed supernatural backup. So when we say the Kusarikku stood at the gates of the gods, that should not be heard only as a dramatic phrase. It should be taken seriously. Ancient temples were not treated as symbolic community centres, where people gathered for a little polite spirituality and then went home with pamphlets. A temple was the house of a god. That was not metaphor in the thin modern sense. It was a sacred residence, a centre of offerings, administration, stored wealth, ritual authority, and divine presence. To approach such a place was to move toward a domain not fully human. The entrance therefore had to make a statement. It had to say that the one inside was not unattended. This is where guardian figures became so important. A god did not need help in the human sense, of course. No Mesopotamian worshipper would have imagined that a carved or invoked guardian physically replaced divine power. That would miss the point. The guardian was part of how divine order was displayed, extended, and made visible within the architecture of the world. It was a sign that sacred authority had reach. It marked the threshold as already under watch. In that respect, the Kusarikku did not stand at a gate because the god was weak. It stood there because the gate was strong. A temple entrance was a perfect place for such a being because entrances are where uncertainty gathers. Inside is belonging. Outside is everything else. Inside is the ordered place of offering, ritual, and divine household. Outside is street, dust, weather, commerce, strangers, noise, rumour, illness, envy, and whatever else the world may decide to bring with it on any given day. The threshold is where those worlds touch. And whenever worlds touch, Mesopotamia preferred not to trust chance. This is why the large protective habits of the civilization matter here. Mesopotamian people did not rely on one kind of defense alone. They built walls, appointed guards, performed rituals, recited incantations, used amulets, placed protective images, and treated vulnerable points with special care. The gate was not just a construction problem, it was a spiritual and symbolic one. A bad force, whether human, divine, or demonic in origin, was imagined as something that could cross into the wrong place if the boundary was neglected. So the boundary was not neglected, it was watched. The Kusarikku fits beautifully into that world, because it is the kind of being that can belong at a gate without seeming wasted there. A decorative animal might beautify the entrance, a human guard might police it, but a bullman guardian does something more. It merges the warning of the beast with the duty of the human. It does not merely stand there, it occupies the threshold with authority. It makes the entrance feel claimed. And temple gates were only one part of this story. Palaces also needed guardians. In Mesopotamia, the palace was never simply a private residence where a ruler went to put his feet up and complain about correspondence. It was a centre of power, storage, ceremony, government, and controlled access. Royal authority depended heavily on being made visible. People had to feel, not just know, that they were entering a space aligned with order and strength. A guarded entrance helped create that feeling before a single word was spoken. Approach matters. The walk toward power is part of power. Imagine moving through a monumental entryway, the surfaces around you carved or marked with signs of protection, strength, and divine backing. Before you see the king, before you hear his officials, before you enter the administrative machinery of the palace, you are already being taught how to understand the place. You're not entering casually. You're crossing into a guarded order. The Kusarikku, in that setting, is not just a protector against spirits or enemies. It is part of the emotional education of the visitor. It says that this centre of authority is not exposed. It has defenders appropriate to its rank. That is one reason guardian figures in the ancient Near East feel so effective even now. They work on several levels at once. They may protect, they may symbolise, they may intimidate, they may honour the sacredness of the place, they may reinforce royal ideology, they may mark the difference between one realm and another. And they do all of this without needing long explanation. The body says enough, the placement says the rest. There is also a narrower and more intimate scale on which protective beings mattered, and that is the household. Ancient Mesopotamians were deeply aware that danger did not only threaten temples and kings. Ordinary homes could be vulnerable too. Sickness entered homes, misfortune entered homes. Spirits, curses, and malevolent forces were imagined to enter homes. The doorway of a house could therefore become a site of concern in its own right. Protective figurines and ritual placements are part of the wider Mesopotamian strategy of defending domestic space, and while the Kusarikku belongs most naturally to the grander world of divine and high-status protection, it also makes sense within this broader threshold logic. The same civilization that protected palaces and temples also worried about who or what might come through the family entrance. That tells us something valuable. Guardians were not only symbols of high theology. They addressed a shared human concern. The concern was simple. What crosses the boundary? A palace asks that question on a large scale. A temple asks it in sacred terms. A house asks it more quietly, but with no less urgency. Who enters? What enters? With what consequences? Once that question is taken seriously, the gate becomes one of the most sensitive points in any structure. And the gate in Mesopotamia was not just a door in a wall. It was a place of transformation. Outside was exposure. Inside was order. Outside was the moving world. Inside was the claimed world. In religious terms, outside was ordinary human territory, and inside might be a zone set apart for divine habitation. In political terms, outside was the public, and inside was controlled access to rule. In household terms, outside was uncertainty, and inside was family continuity. Every one of those crossings needed management. A being like the Kusarikku could manage it symbolically because it embodied the very qualities a threshold required. It had force enough to resist. It had human direction enough to remain stationed. It belonged to the category of beings that did not simply frighten. They supervised. That is why the phrase "stood watch" suits it so well. Watching is not only about seeing, it's about holding a boundary through presence. A watched place feels different from an unwatched one. A watched gate feels claimed. A watched entrance changes conduct. You lower your voice. You step more carefully. You understand that crossing this line is noticed. The divine side of this becomes even more interesting when we remember that Mesopotamian gods were not imagined as distant abstractions floating far above practical life. They had houses, temples, cult statues, offerings, attendants, festivals, and property. Their worship was embedded in the daily life of cities. That meant the gates of the gods were real civic features as well as sacred ideas. They were built, maintained, adorned, approached, and crossed. So to station a guardian at such a gate was to make theology architectural. It took the idea that a god's domain should be defended and gave that idea a visible body at the point where everyone had to confront it. This is one reason why the Kusarikku should not be thought of only as a creature somewhere in the background of myth. It is much more active than that. It belongs at the interface between myth and use. The ancient person did not need to choose whether the guardian was symbolic or functional, in the way a modern museum visitor might. The guardian was symbolic because it was functional, and functional because it was symbolic. It helped define what sort of place this was. It contributed to the protective work of the space simply by being present there within the accepted logic of the culture. There is also something worth saying about gates themselves. Gates are not neutral things. Even in modern life, gates imply choice, control, and permission. A road without a gate is open passage. A road with a gate is a question. Who is allowed in? Who is kept out? On what terms? In a city, a gate can mean defense. In a palace, it can mean hierarchy. In a temple, it can mean sanctity. In every case, a gate exists because unrestricted movement is not desirable. The Kusarikku is perfectly suited to that setting because it is itself a figure of restricted movement. It does not invite the world in. It judges the crossing. If that sounds severe, it is meant to. Mesopotamian sacred and royal spaces were not casual zones of free wandering. Access mattered, purity mattered, rank mattered, correct approach mattered. Offerings had their place, officials had their place, priests had their place, outsiders had their limits. Boundaries were not an embarrassing sign of exclusion. They were a sign of order. A guardian at the entrance did not apologize for the existence of the boundary. It enforced its seriousness. That seriousness extended not only to what could be seen, but to what could not. One of the striking features of Mesopotamian protective practice is how often it addresses invisible threats. A threshold might be secure against a human intruder and still be considered open to something worse. Disease, curse, envy, hostile magic, wandering spirits, demons, divine anger, all of these belong to the ancient map of danger. The gate had to be defended against more than bodies. It had to be defended against forces. A powerful hybrid guardian could do that work in a way a normal human sentry never could, because the hybrid guardian belonged partly to the same, larger supernatural world as the threats it opposed. This is where the Kusarikku becomes especially at home, at the gates of the gods. Not only because the gods deserved guardians, but because a divine threshold required a defender that spoke the language of more than human power. A man with a spear is useful against a thief. A bullman guardian stationed in sacred imagination is useful against the idea that disorder can simply cross where it pleases. That is a different level of defense. It is defense at the level of worldview. And worldview mattered very much in Mesopotamia. This was a civilization that understood architecture as part of cosmic order. Temples connected city life to divine favour. Palaces connected kingship to legitimate control. Gates connected inside to outside under terms set by power. To guard those connections was to guard the whole social and sacred system in miniature. The Kusarikku was therefore not just watching a doorway, it was watching a relationship. The relationship between city and god, between ruler and realm, between protected space and surrounding uncertainty, between what had been claimed and what remained beyond. That may be why threshold guardians are so enduringly compelling across cultures. They dramatise a truth people never quite outgrow. The things that matter most are usually vulnerable at their edges. Homes are vulnerable at the door. Nations are vulnerable at the border. Trust is vulnerable at the moment of testing. Sacredness is vulnerable at the point of contact with ordinary life. We keep trying, in one way or another, to place guardians at those edges. Mesopotamia did it with great seriousness and tremendous imagination. There's another practical layer here too. Gates are where audiences form. They are where petitioners wait, where messengers arrive, where processions begin or end, where the first encounter with authority often takes place. A guardian figure stationed there therefore becomes part of public memory. People may not remember every administrative detail of a palace visit, but they remember what it felt like to stand before a guarded entrance. They remember the size of things, the silence, the controlled movement, the sense of being measured. The Kusarikku in that setting helps shape the experience of power before power even speaks. It also helps shape the experience of reverence. A temple entrance needs to do something different from a market entrance. It needs to tell you that your body, your speech and your expectations should change as you cross. This is another reason guardian figures belong there. They prepare the mind, they slow you down, they make casual movement feel inappropriate, they place the threshold under a kind of pressure. A gate of the gods should not feel like a side door to a warehouse. It should feel guarded, and a bullman is a very persuasive way to achieve that effect. What all of this means is that the Kusarikku stood watch wherever boundaries needed more than bricks. It belonged at entrances where force had to be visible, where sacred or royal claims had to be reinforced, where outsiders had to feel the difference between before and after crossing, and where unseen threats were taken seriously enough to be answered with more than practical locks. Temple gates, palace approaches, guarded thresholds, and the symbolic edge of divine space all fall naturally into that world. And once we see the Kusarikku there, once we picture it stationed not in some vague mythic nowhere, but at the very places where gods were housed, kings were approached, and dangerous crossings were controlled, another question begins to rise from that image. If this bullman stood watch at the boundaries of divine order, then what exactly was its relationship to the powers inside? Was it merely a guardian near the gods, or was it part of the larger world of the Anunnaki themselves, a servant, defender, or attendant shaped to protect the households of beings who ruled far more than any human city ever could? If the Kusarikku stood at the gates of the gods, then the next question is impossible to avoid. Why would divine powers need guardians at all? At first glance, it sounds almost backwards. A modern listener might reasonably think that a god, especially one belonging to the great old Mesopotamian world of the Anunnaki, should not need anyone standing at the door on its behalf. If divine beings are powerful, why station protectors near them? Why carve guardians, invoke guardians, or imagine them holding the line at sacred thresholds? Should not a god be fully capable of handling any intruder, visible or invisible, with one stern glance and perhaps a small but memorable thunderstorm? The answer begins with a useful correction. In Mesopotamian thought, a guardian at a divine threshold did not exist because the god was weak. The guardian existed because the place was strong, The boundary was important, and power in the ancient world was expected to be ordered, displayed, and attended. A god's house was not less divine because it had guardians. It was more fully divine because it was surrounded by the full architecture of rank, service, and protection that true authority deserved. That is the key to understanding the relationship between the Kusarikku and the Anunnaki. A guardian does not imply deficiency, it implies status. We still understand this instinct now, though we dress it in more modern clothing. The most powerful people in the world tend to have the most security, not because they are fragile in some embarrassing personal sense, but because their rank, influence, and symbolic importance demand layers of control. Important buildings have guarded entrances, sacred places have restricted areas. Wealthy institutions do not leave the front door open with a handwritten note saying, "Please be respectful." Power, for all its reach, still organises space around itself. The greater the importance of what lies within, the more attention is given to the boundary. Mesopotamia took that principle seriously. Its divine world was not imagined as a loose cloud of supernatural personalities drifting about in a vague heaven. It was structured. It had households, domains, hierarchies, decrees, temple residences, sacred property, divine symbols, and all the complexity you would expect from a civilization that loved administration almost as much as it loved omens. The gods ruled, yes, but they did not rule in a shapeless way. They ruled through order. They ruled through place. They ruled through role and rank. The Anunnaki, broadly understood as a high and ancient company of divine powers within Mesopotamian tradition, belonged to exactly that kind of world. And a world like that naturally has attendants. This is one of the easiest details for modern people to miss, because we often imagine gods as solitary figures of pure force. We picture a deity as an isolated source of power, enough in itself, requiring nothing around it. Ancient religions did not always think so sparsely. Divine beings had courts. They had servants, messengers, gatekeepers, heralds, protectors, and ritual personnel on the human side who maintained their earthly houses. A god did not become less divine by being surrounded with functionaries. In many ways, the opposite was true. A well-attended god was a visibly great god. That same logic applies to guardians like the Kusarikku. If a divine power is important enough to have a house, that house has a threshold. If it has a threshold, that threshold matters. If it matters, then it must be protected. Not because the god will panic without help, but because sacred order is expressed through proper arrangement. The gateway of a divine being should look, feel, and function like the gateway of a divine being. It should not resemble the side entrance to a grain shed. The more one looks at Mesopotamian culture, the more obvious this becomes. Temples were houses of the gods, but they were also storehouses, economic centres, ritual stages, political symbols, and points where heaven and earth were thought to meet. Offerings moved through them. Priests worked in them. Records were kept for them. Festivals centred on them. Statues of gods were housed and cared for within them. The temple was not a vague monument to spiritual ideas. It was a place of presence and management. That means a guardian at such a place was not decorative excess. It was part of the normal grammar of seriousness. The Kusarikku makes particular sense in this setting, because it is neither ordinary enough to be merely civic, nor distant enough to be one of the highest gods themselves. It sits in the middle. That middle position is exactly what a guardian needs. Too human, and the figure becomes a servant without supernatural weight. Too divine in the higher sense, and the figure becomes the centre rather than the protector of the centre. The bullman solves this neatly. It is elevated, forceful, more than human, and yet clearly suited to service. It belongs near the powers of the Anunnaki because it is impressive without displacing them, and that last part matters. Ancient sacred environments were carefully arranged. Rank had to remain visible. A guardian should command respect, but not confusion about who truly ruled within. The Kusarikku can stand at the gate, radiate force, and still make it clear that something even greater lies beyond. In fact, that is one of its most useful jobs. The Guardian increases the dignity of what it guards. It tells the approaching visitor, if this is what stands outside, consider what must stand within. There is also another reason divine powers needed guardians, and it has to do with how the Mesopotamian world imagined danger. The ancient universe was not cleanly divided into a safe divine realm above and an unsafe human realm below. Rather, the whole cosmos was active and contested. There were hostile spirits, afflicting demons, disruptive forces, curses, illnesses, ill omens, divine anger, and the persistent possibility that order might be disturbed. Gods represented order, kingship, fertility, justice, storms, wisdom, and many other powers, but the world around them still required maintenance. Sacred boundaries were part of that maintenance. A guardian, then, was not only there to block rude humans from wandering in where they did not belong. It was also part of a much larger protective effort against disorder itself. That may sound dramatic, but ancient Mesopotamians were not embarrassed by dramatic stakes. Disorder was not a metaphorical inconvenience. It could ruin crops, topple kings, spread disease, contaminate households, and upset ritual balance. Against that background, it makes perfect sense that divine powers would be imagined as surrounded by layers of defense. A well-ordered divine house should not be open to interference. Even gods, it seems, appreciated competent security. To put it another way, a guardian near the Anunnaki was not a bodyguard in the modern action film sense. It was a threshold specialist. It helped define who belonged where. It helped keep sacred things in their place and harmful things out of place. It declared that the realm of divine order had edges, and those edges were not soft. This is crucial because one of the most important ideas in Mesopotamian religion is that boundaries matter. The line between pure and impure matters. The line between sacred and ordinary matters. The line between a god's domain and the outside world matters. A guardian is what happens when those lines are given a body. That body, in the case of the Kusarikku, was particularly well chosen for the world of the Anunnaki because the Anunnaki themselves were associated with deep authority. In later popular imagination, the term sometimes gets stretched into all sorts of things, but within the older Mesopotamian context, it points toward a company of great divine powers connected with cosmic order, earthly rule, judgment, and the larger structure of the world. These were not local household sprites. They were not decorative heavenly ornaments. They belonged to the architecture of reality as Mesopotamia understood it. And whenever reality is imagined as ruled by ranked, serious powers, the spaces nearest those powers become especially charged. Charged places need management. This may be the best way to think about it. The closer one comes to sacred power, the more careful the arrangement must be. There are procedures, there are thresholds, there are proper ways of approaching. There are things one may carry and things one may not. There are words to be spoken, words not to be spoken, gestures, offerings, purifications, and restrictions. A guardian stands within that whole world of controlled access. It says that approach is possible, but not casual. Presence is available, but not unmanaged. There is a difference between being invited into order and barging into it. The Kusarikku therefore belongs to a theology of controlled nearness. Human beings may approach the gods through their temples, offerings, and rituals, but the approach is framed. A divine realm is not an open field. It is a defended domain. The bullman makes that defence visible in a way a simple wall never could. Walls tell you there is a boundary. A guardian tells you the boundary is awake. And because the Anunnaki were imagined as rulers, judges and powers beyond ordinary human standing, their guardians would naturally reflect that seriousness. It would not do to assign a sleepy goat and a mildly concerned doorkeeper to the threshold of a great Mesopotamian god. The visual language had to match the rank of the reality. That is why hybrid beings are so appropriate here. They gather more force into one form than ordinary beings can. They look as though they belong to the world they guard. This point becomes even clearer if we remember how often ancient Near Eastern kings modelled themselves on divine patterns. Palaces and temples were not identical, but they echoed one another in important ways. Royal authority drew legitimacy from divine order. Sacred architecture influenced political display. Human kingship wanted to look aligned with the structure of the cosmos. That meant the use of guardians in royal settings and divine settings was not a coincidence. It was part of one large idea. Proper power is attended. Proper rule is guarded. Great households, whether divine or royal, do not leave their thresholds undefended. So when the Kusarikku appears in relation to the Anunnaki, it is doing more than standing near some vague set of gods. It is participating in a very old understanding that divine order deserves visible defence. It helps extend divine authority outward to the gate itself. It means the sacred household begins before one enters the interior. The threshold has already been claimed. That claim matters not only to the visitor, but to the whole symbolic environment. A guardian near the gods reassures worshippers, warns intruders, reinforces the status of priests and rulers, and helps weave the architecture into the theology. In a world where images were not passive, and where protective figures could belong to ritual action, as well as visual design, the Kusarikku would have done real conceptual work. It held the line between the divine sphere and the unstable world beyond. It made the sacred perimeter feel real. There is also a deeper emotional truth behind all this. Human beings have always wanted the highest things to be secure. We want the holy to be protected. We want justice to have defenders. We want what is good, meaningful, and powerful to be guarded against corruption or attack. Ancient Mesopotamia felt this strongly. Its temples were not just buildings, but guarantees of relationship between city and god. If a temple was maintained properly, the city remained in order. If offerings were given, rituals performed, boundaries respected, then divine favour might continue. A guardian at that threshold therefore protected more than a room. It protected the relationship. This is one of the strongest reasons divine powers needed guardians. Not because the gods would be personally helpless without them, but because human communities needed to know that the line holding sacred order in place was defended. A city wants to feel that its god's house is secure. A worshipper wants to feel that divine power is not casually exposed. A king wants the temple and palace alike to display stability. Guardians answer those needs all at once. They are theological reassurance in visible form, and that reassurance could also work by fear. Not all comfort is gentle. Some comfort comes from knowing that what guards you is considerably nastier than what threatens you. The Kusarikku belongs to that category. It is not a soft lamp in a window. It is a forceful figure at a charged boundary. It reassures by looking as though it would be a very bad day for anything that crossed wrongly. Ancient people understood that sort of reassurance perfectly well. Quite a lot of protective symbolism throughout history depends on the same principle. There is one more layer here, and it concerns service itself. Mesopotamian religion did not shy away from the language of service. Humans served gods through offerings and ritual care. Priests served within temple systems. Officials served kings. Lesser powers served greater ones. Cosmic order was often imagined through relationships of duty. The Kusarikku fits beautifully into that world because it does not challenge the authority of the Anunnaki. It serves it. It turns force into loyalty. It stands near greatness without trying to become greatness. In that sense, the bullman reflects one of the core values of ancient order. Strength should know its place. That is a very revealing idea. To modern ears, service can sound passive or diminished, but in the ancient Mesopotamian world it could be honourable, necessary and central to how the universe held together. Great powers were surrounded by proper attendants because proper arrangement was itself part of greatness. A divine realm without guardians would feel strangely unfinished. A great god without defended thresholds would feel oddly unannounced. The Kusarikku helps complete the picture. It gives the divine household the gravity its status requires. It also preserves hierarchy without weakening awe. That balance is harder than it sounds. A guardian must be mighty enough to impress, but not so mighty that the viewer forgets the superiority of the god within. The Kusarikku manages this by embodying concentrated power without becoming the ultimate object of devotion. It is a guardian, not the throne. It is a servant of order, not order's source. That distinction would have been clear in a culture deeply trained to read rank, ritual place, and symbolic function. And perhaps this is why the Kusarikku work so well in the larger world of the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki, understood as the high divine powers of Mesopotamian tradition, represent a world already full of authority, decree, and cosmic seriousness. The bullman is not out of place there. It is exactly the kind of being one expects to find at the edge of such a world, strong enough to signal the rank of what lies within, ordered enough to remain at its post, strange enough to feel more than human, familiar enough to be read immediately as a defender. The more we sit with that image, the clearer it becomes that divine powers needed guardians in the same way a king needs a throne room, a court, and a seal. Not because the power is absent without these things, but because power becomes visible, structured, and socially real through them. A guardian is one of the ways sacred authority enters space. It is one of the ways the invisible becomes architectural. It is one of the ways people know, before a word is spoken or an offering laid down, that this is not ordinary ground. And once we understand that, the Kusarikku begins to stand not only at the edge of divine space, but at the centre of a larger Mesopotamian pattern. Guardians were not optional extras attached to the world of the gods. They were part of how sacred and royal environments declared themselves, which means that from here, the next step is to look outward again, into the built world of temple walls, palace entrances, carved reliefs, and ceremonial spaces, and ask how the bullman moved from sacred idea into visible form, how it entered temples, palaces, and the art of Mesopotamia as something people could actually see standing before them. Once the Kusarikku is understood as a guardian connected to divine order, the next thing to notice is that Mesopotamia did not leave such beings trapped in thought. It brought them out into the visible world. That is one of the most revealing habits of the ancient Near East. A symbol was not always left to live only in a prayer, a story, or a learned explanation. It could be built into the actual spaces where people moved, waited, served, worshipped, petitioned, and ruled. It could be carved, modelled, painted, buried beneath thresholds, set near entrances, or worked into the larger visual system of a temple or palace. In other words, the Kusarikku did not matter only because someone once described a bullman guardian in words. It mattered because Mesopotamian civilization knew how to make protection visible. That was not a small thing. Visibility changes belief. A protective force that remains entirely invisible may still be trusted, but a protective force that can be seen becomes part of the environment. It shapes how a place feels before anyone speaks. It turns an idea into a presence. The bullman, once brought into temples, palaces, and sacred art, stopped being just a concept and became part of the lived experience of Mesopotamian space. This is where ancient architecture becomes especially important. A temple was not simply an empty shell waiting for ritual to happen inside it. A palace was not merely a roof over administration. These buildings were environments designed to communicate status, authority, sacredness, and control. Their walls, thresholds, courtyards, reliefs, sculptures, and planned approaches all work together. Every serious civilization learns that power is easier to maintain when it is also staged. Mesopotamia understood this very well. It did not present sacred and royal life as plain practical business, carried out behind blank mud brick walls with no concern for atmosphere. It turned atmosphere into part of the business. So the Kusarikku, when it entered the visible world, entered a setting already prepared for beings of that kind. It belonged among other protective and symbolic figures. It belonged in the places where ancient people expected important images to do more than simply decorate. A protective figure at a threshold was never just there to fill empty space. It was there because the threshold required a statement. It required visible force. It required a sign that what lay beyond was not unattended. This is one of the reasons Mesopotamian art can feel so different from modern decoration. In a modern house, someone may hang a framed print because the wall feels a little bare and the furniture has not yet solved the problem. In an ancient Mesopotamian temple or palace, a guardian image was not there because somebody decided the entrance could use a touch more character. It was there because the entrance was a sensitive point, and sensitive points needed to be marked and defended. Art was part of management. That is worth pausing over, because it changes how we understand the whole visual world around the Kusarikku. The bullman did not enter visibility by becoming a casual artistic subject, as if some sculptor simply thought the design looked interesting. It entered visibility because Mesopotamian civilization believed images could participate in the work of protection. Once that is understood, it becomes much easier to imagine how a figure like the Kusarikku belonged in sacred and royal settings. Its body was a message, its placement was a warning, its visibility was functional. Temples were one obvious place for this. A god's house has to look like a god's house. It had to feel claimed, ordered, and different from ordinary structures. Approaching such a building was not meant to feel the same as walking toward a storeroom or an ordinary residence. One crossed into a zone of ceremony, offering divine presence and controlled access. The closer one came to the entrance, the more serious the building had to become. Guardian images helped create that seriousness. They stood in the visual field of the worshipper, the priest, the visitor, and the official. They helped turn approach into preparation, and that preparation mattered. A visible guardian at or near a temple threshold reminded people that this was not open ground. It was already under supervision. Even if the guardian was represented in relief, figurine form, or another sacred medium rather than as a freestanding monumental sculpture every time, the message remained the same. The space was claimed. Whatever happened here happened under divine order. The bullman was one more way of saying that sacred architecture did not begin at the inner room, it began at the edge. Palaces worked similarly, though with a different emphasis. A palace had to display royal authority before the ruler ever appeared. It had to manage access, produce awe, and reinforce hierarchy. Visitors did not simply stroll in and start making suggestions. They were made to move through controlled, meaningful space. Gateways, courtyards, audience approaches, decorated walls, and protective figures all contributed to the lesson. The lesson was that authority resided here, and authority had shape, weight, and defenders. A bullman guardian entering that environment was not out of place at all. It fit naturally into the visual program of power. This is especially important because royal and sacred spaces in Mesopotamia were not sharply divided in the modern way. They were different, certainly, but they echoed one another. Kingship drew its legitimacy from divine order. Temples were economically and politically significant. Palaces used sacred symbolism. Gods and rulers both occupied structured households with rules of access, attendance, and protected thresholds. A guardian like the Kusarikku could therefore move through the symbolic world of both without seeming misplaced. It belonged wherever important order needed visible defense. Sacred art is where this becomes even more interesting. Art in Mesopotamia was not simply about making a record of what existed. It was about shaping an environment of meaning. Reliefs, plaques, figurines, cylinder seals, carved thresholds, and protective deposits all show a civilization deeply comfortable with putting symbolic beings into material form. The Kusarikku, as part of the wider protective imagination, entered that artistic world because art was one of the main ways Mesopotamia made unseen realities intelligible. a supernatural guardian could be thought, invoked, and ritually employed, yes, but it could also be seen. That visibility helped bind the supernatural order to the built one. There is something deeply practical in that. Human beings trust what they can repeatedly encounter. A priest may know the proper incantations. A scholar may know the names and classifications of protective beings. A king may know the ideology of divine favour. But the ordinary eye needs a form. It needs a sign that says this place is guarded. The visible bullman provides that. It lets protective knowledge move out of specialist ritual and into shared public perception. That does not mean everyone understood every detail in the same way. Ancient societies were as varied as any other. Some people would have approached guardian figures with ritual seriousness, some with habit, some with fear, some with simple acceptance. A worker hauling materials through a palace court every day may not have stopped to meditate on the full symbolic logic of every guardian form. But that does not lessen the image's power. Repetition itself has force. The more often a culture places certain beings at its protected edges, the more natural it becomes to feel those edges as watched. The bullman did not have to be consciously analysed by every passerby to do its work. It only had to be there, again and again, at places where importance gathered. This is one reason the entrance into visible art matters so much. Once a guardian becomes part of architecture and image, it enters memory more reliably. It begins to shape expectation. People start to understand that serious spaces come with serious protectors. That expectation then reinforces the authority of the spaces themselves. A temple without visible signs of sacred protection might feel strangely unfinished. A royal approach without guardian imagery might feel less controlled. Visibility does not merely reflect power, it strengthens it. There is also the matter of scale. Some guardian forms in the ancient Near East were large and monumental, while others were smaller, more intimate, even hidden within the structure as part of protective deposits, or placed in ways not meant for broad theatrical display. This range is revealing. It tells us that the visible world of protection operated on several levels. Some guardians confronted the eye directly. Others worked more quietly, embedded in foundations, thresholds, and ritual settings. A figure like the Kusarikku belongs comfortably across that spectrum because its meaning is strong whether encountered dramatically or more discreetly. The body of the bullman already carries enough symbolic force to function in multiple settings. And the choice of setting changed how the figure would be read. At a major entrance, the bullman becomes a public warning and a declaration of status. In a more private ritual or protective deposit, it becomes part of the hidden defense of the building. In a carved scene, it may contribute to a larger visual theology, in which the protected world is shown as surrounded by beings appropriate to its rank. In every case, the same central logic survives. The guardian has entered matter. Protection has become local. That phrase matters. Protection has become local. Mesopotamia was not content to leave sacred order floating in generalities. It wanted sacred order located in walls, doors, statues, shrines, rooms, boundaries, and ceremonial routes. A city had its god, a temple had its precinct, a palace had its approach, a household had its door. Once the world is imagined that way, guardians naturally become tied to actual places. The Kusarikku did not guard in the abstract. It guarded somewhere. And art helped define that somewhere. It told the viewer where one had arrived and what kind of place this was. It also did something more subtle. It trained the eye to link hybrid guardians with authority. The more such beings appeared in important spaces, the more they taught people how to read power. A creature that might seem strange in isolation stopped seeming strange when seen repeatedly in the company of sacred architecture, royal display, and ritual seriousness. It became legible. It became part of the vocabulary of importance. This is especially true in a civilization as visually disciplined as Mesopotamia. Ancient Mesopotamian art is rarely random. Figures are placed with thought. Hierarchies are visible. Symmetry often matters. Repetition matters. Attribute matters. Beards, crowns, horns, stance, weapons, wings, posture, and relative size all communicate. The Kusarikku, once brought into that system, did not need a caption explaining itself. It joined a world where symbols were expected to speak. The ancient viewer read bodies the way modern viewers read headlines, quickly and with a sense that form carries meaning. There is another side to this too, and it is emotional rather than analytical. A visible guardian changes how a place feels because it changes how one's body moves through it. You walk differently when you sense you're entering protected territory. You lower your voice, you become more careful, you look up. You feel, even without fully articulating it, that this place has rules. A bullman guardian in art or architecture contributes to that bodily experience. It slows ordinary movement and replaces it with approach. That is exactly what sacred and royal thresholds need. The effect would have been even stronger in ceremonial contexts. Festivals, processions, offerings, formal audiences, temple duties and royal encounters all rely partly on controlled movement through meaningful space. Guardians help stage that control. They stand where the body crosses from one condition into another, from street into precinct, from outer area into inner space, from common movement into formal access. The Kusarikku in the visible world therefore belongs not only to static art but to lived choreography. People passed beneath its symbolic watch. They carried offerings under its authority. They approached rulers and gods through environments shaped by beings like it. This tells us something important about ancient belief. Belief is not just a matter of ideas held privately in the mind. It is also a matter of spaces designed to make those ideas feel true. Mesopotamia excelled at that. It created buildings, images, rituals, and approaches that did not merely state that divine and royal order existed. They made one feel it. The bullman guardian entering sacred art was part of that achievement. It helped turn theology into architecture, anxiety into defense, and symbolic force into something almost tangible. And of course there was beauty in it too, though beauty in the ancient protective world does not always look soft or pleasant in the modern sense. There is beauty in confidence, in strong outlines, in controlled repetition, in a figure that looks as though it belongs exactly where it has been placed. A guardian can be intimidating and still beautifully suited to its task. Mesopotamian sacred art often works that way. It is not merely trying to please the eye. It is trying to persuade the mind that order has taken visible form. The Kusarikku is beautiful in that hard, useful sense. It looks right for a civilization that wanted its boundaries to be both meaningful and defended. There's one more thing the visible world of temples and palaces did for the Kusarikku. It gave the figure permanence. A spoken word can vanish, a ritual can end, a procession can pass, but a carved or placed guardian remains. It keeps watch between events. It makes protection continuous. Even when no ceremony is underway, the building is still guarded. Even when the king is absent, the palace still announces its defended character. Even when the worshipper has gone home, the threshold remains under sign. Material form extends sacred seriousness across time. That permanence would have mattered deeply in a culture so concerned with stability. Mesopotamian life was often uncertain, but its institutions fought uncertainty with repetition, inscription, architecture, and formal structure. Guardian art belongs to that battle against instability. It fixes the defense in place. It says that the threshold will not depend solely on the mood or memory of the next human attendant. The building itself has been taught how to guard. Seen that way, the entrance of the Kusarikku into temples, palaces, and sacred art was not an afterthought. It was the natural completion of what the figure already was. A guardian remains incomplete if it is never stationed. A protective being remains half-formed if it is never attached to place. The visible world gave the bullman its post. It made the Kusarikku part of lived architecture, public memory and ritual experience. It let people encounter the Guardian not merely as a tale from somewhere beyond, but as a force made present at the edge of important spaces. And once the Bullman has entered that visible world, once it stands among walls, thresholds, reliefs, and guarded approaches, another question comes into focus. A figure like this was not only meant to be seen, it was meant to protect. That means we now have to look more closely at the practical side of that protection, at the rituals, incantations, and defensive uses that made beings like the Kusarikku part of Mesopotamia's broader system of sacred security, where the Bullman did not just stand beautifully in art, but actively belonged to the world of ritual defense. Once the Kusarikku has entered the visible world of temples, palaces, and guarded thresholds, the next thing to understand is that Mesopotamia did not rely on images alone. The Guardian could be carved, painted, modelled, or placed at an entrance, but that visible presence was only one part of a much larger protective system. Ancient Mesopotamian civilization was deeply invested in ritual defense. It did not assume that danger could always be seen with the eye, and because of that, it developed ways of protecting space that worked through words, gestures, buried objects, spoken formulas, purification acts, and carefully placed figures whose power was activated not only by appearance, but by ritual use. This is where the Kusarikku becomes even more interesting, because the Bullman belongs not just to the art of protection, but to the working machinery of sacred defense. That phrase may sound severe, but there is really no better way to put it. Mesopotamia treated protection as a serious practical matter. A house, a temple, a palace, a gate, or a city wall was never secure merely because it existed physically. It also had to be defended symbolically and ritually. The ancient world was full of vulnerabilities that could not be solved with bricks alone. A bad spirit did not care that the door was well made. A curse did not politely remain outdoors because the threshold had been recently swept. Illness, bad omens, malicious magic, divine displeasure, and hostile unseen forces belonged to the Mesopotamian map of reality, and people responded to them with systems. Those systems included incantations, exorcistic procedures, purifications, amulets, protective deposits, and the placement of guardian beings whose forms were chosen for specific defensive work. That is the environment in which the Kusarikku begins to feel fully alive. It was not simply a figure to be admired from a distance. It was part of a protective logic that linked image and ritual together. In Mesopotamian thought, the visible and invisible were never far apart. A being could be represented in material form and also invoked through words. A protective power could be stationed in art and also installed through ceremony. A threshold could be guarded both by what stood beside it and by what had been placed beneath it. This was not redundancy. It was layered defense. Modern people still do this in milder and more secular ways. We put locks on doors, yes, but also alarms, cameras, warning signs, and sometimes symbolic items that make us feel a place is safer or more claimed. We do not usually bury clay guardians under our floorboards, though there is something admirably decisive about that approach. Still, the instinct is recognizable. When something matters, one line of defense feels insufficient. Ancient Mesopotamia shared that instinct, only extended it into the sacred and ritual dimensions of life with much greater confidence. This is why incantations mattered so much. An incantation was not idle speech. It was not a decorative poem recited because silence felt awkward. It was a formal act, part of an established body of ritual practice meant to address danger through words that carried authority. Mesopotamian ritual specialists understood that words could identify, confront, repel, and order the unseen. To name a hostile force was already to begin placing it within a system. To recite the proper formula was to bring trained speech against danger. To accompany that speech with gestures, objects, purifications, and protective figures was to reinforce the defense on multiple levels at once. The Kusarikku fits naturally into this world because it is exactly the kind of being that could be enlisted in sacred defense. Its body already says protection. Its symbolic makeup already combines the qualities that a dangerous threshold requires. A bull gives it brute force. The human element gives it directed purpose. Once that figure is brought into ritual use, it becomes more than a sign. It becomes part of the defensive action itself. One of the striking things about Mesopotamian protective practice is how concrete it could be. Evil was not fought only through vague hope or general prayer. Protective rites often involved the making, handling, placing or burying of figurines and symbolic objects. Certain beings were represented physically and positioned in places where danger might enter or where a building needed defense. Doorways, corners, foundations, walls, and thresholds could all become sites of ritual installation. The logic behind this is very clear once one understands the Mesopotamian worldview. If hostile forces move through space, then protective powers should also occupy space. If danger crosses boundaries, then the boundary should be actively defended. The building itself becomes part of the ritual field. The Kusarikku belongs comfortably in that field. A bullman guardian is exactly the kind of being one would want stationed, where force and vigilance are most needed. When placed or invoked in connection with thresholds and protected areas, it contributes to the sense that the entrance is not open ground. The threshold is no longer merely architectural. It has been ritually claimed. It has defenders. It has witnesses. It has power at work there even when no human is present. This is one reason Mesopotamian sacred defense can seem so sophisticated. It did not separate practical protection from symbolic protection in the way many modern people do. A doorway did not have to choose whether it was physically closed or ritually guarded. It could be both. A palace wall did not have to choose whether it relied on soldiers or sacred defences. It could have both. A temple precinct did not have to choose between ritual purity and visual intimidation. It could combine them. The Kusarikku makes sense precisely because it belongs to a culture comfortable with layered solutions. There is also a strong emotional intelligence behind this system. Human beings feel safer when they believe defense is active rather than passive. A locked door is good. A watched door is better. A watched and defended door, especially one supported by beings of sacred power, is better still. Mesopotamian ritual seems to understand that deep need for active protection. It is not enough to hope nothing bad will happen. One wants to know that something is standing against it. The Kusarikku answers that need in direct form. It is not a polite ornament suggesting general goodwill. It is a force stationed against intrusion, and intrusion, in Mesopotamian thought, was a broad category. It included enemies and thieves, certainly, but it also included afflicting demons, malevolent spirits, bad luck, impurity, magical attack, and the subtle harms that could enter a household or sacred environment without warning. This is crucial, because the bullman's ritual role cannot be understood if we reduce protection to simple physical defense. The greater part of Mesopotamian ritual defense was concerned with harms that were invisible, contagious, unlucky, or spiritually dangerous. A figure like the Kusarikku was therefore valuable not because it looked like it could win a wrestling match, though one suspects it could, but because it belonged to the more than human level where such harms were confronted. That is why magic and incantation are so closely tied to guardian beings. In a Mesopotamian setting, what we call magic was not necessarily fringe or theatrical. It was often formal, trained, and integrated into religious and protective practice. Ritual experts used prescribed texts, materials, gestures, and sequences to manage misfortune and repel danger. Protective beings were part of that larger repertoire. They could be invoked as allies in sacred defense. Their images could be used in installations meant to fortify a space. Their presence reinforced the ritual claim that order was being actively restored and maintained. The Kusarikku's form would have been especially useful in such work because it speaks a language hostile forces are meant to understand. Again, This is something modern readers sometimes underestimate. Protective figures often look intimidating because intimidation is useful. A pleasant and harmless image may comfort a child, but it is not designed to terrify whatever threatens the child. Mesopotamian guardians were meant to stand against serious danger, and serious danger called for serious imagery. The bullman tells hostile powers that the threshold is defended by force that is both natural and more than natural, directed and unwavering. It is not there for conversation. It is there to hold the line. That line could be maintained in several ways. One was through fixed presence, the guardian image already installed in or near the structure. Another was through activated ritual, where words, offerings, gestures and formulas made the protective force present in a more immediate sense. Yet another was through repeated maintenance, because Mesopotamian sacred defense was not always a one-time event. Like many ancient systems of order, it depended on renewal. Rituals were repeated. Purifications were performed again. Texts were recited properly. Protective arrangements were maintained because the world did not stop threatening simply because one had been careful last year. This repeated care tells us something important about how Mesopotamians viewed protection. They did not imagine safety as a permanent possession won once and for all. They imagined it as something maintained. That makes perfect sense in a civilization shaped by irrigation, agriculture, dynastic shifts, floods, war, disease, and the constant need to keep systems functioning. The same mentality that repaired canals and kept records also returned again and again to ritual defense. A protected house must remain protected. A guarded threshold must remain guarded. A god's residence must remain pure. The Kusarikku therefore belongs not just to a moment of installation, but to an ongoing culture of maintenance. There is also a practical brilliance in the way guardian figures helps turn ritual into memory. A spoken incantation ends when the voice stops. A purification rite concludes. A specialist goes home. But a guardian image remains. It keeps the result of the ritual present in material form. It reminds everyone who sees it that protection is in place. It also allows the building itself to participate in the defense after the ritual moment has passed. The Kusarikku in that sense is both event and permanence. It can belong to the living act of sacred defense, and then continue watching once the candles, incense, water, or spoken words are gone. This matters especially for thresholds, because thresholds are always active. A room may be empty for hours, but the threshold remains the place where crossing happens. The danger point is built into the architecture. That is why Mesopotamian ritual attention so often gathers there. Doors, corners, gates, and foundations are where vulnerability concentrates. They are where sacred defense must be anchored. The Kusarikku, because it is so strongly tied to guarding, becomes an ideal being for those points. It embodies the idea that nothing passes here unchallenged. One can almost imagine the psychological effect this had on the people who lived with such systems. To know that your home, temple, or palace had not only walls and servants, but ritually installed defenders must have created a deep sense of enclosure and order. The world beyond might remain uncertain, but the threshold had been addressed. That is a powerful form of reassurance. Even now, people sleep better when they feel the house is secure. Mesopotamians were no different in that basic respect. They simply expanded security into the sacred realm with remarkable thoroughness. And because the protection was sacred, it also carried moral and cosmic weight. A guarded threshold did not only say, "Keep out," it also said, "This place belongs to order." It has been aligned properly. It stands under the care of powers that support right arrangement. The Kusarikku therefore protects not only physical space, but the legitimacy of that space. It helps establish that the house, palace, or temple is not a loose collection of rooms. It is a defended centre of proper relations. To cross into it wrongly is not just trespass. It is an offence against order itself. This is one reason guardian figures work so well with incantations. Incantations often do more than banish. They declare, classify and restore. They reassert the proper arrangement of the world. They say, in effect, this belongs here, that does not. This force is welcomed. That force is expelled. The Kusarikku is the visual equivalent of that logic. Its entire form says that strength has been appointed to defend the proper place of things. It is the body of exclusion in service to order. There is probably also a social dimension here worth noticing. Ritual specialists, priests, exorcists, and learned experts were custodians of protective knowledge. They knew the texts, formulas, placements, and procedures required to defend a household or sacred structure. Guardian beings, like the Kusarikku, therefore connect elite knowledge to ordinary experience. The expert might know precisely which incantation to recite, or where a protective figure should be placed, but once the guardian is installed, the entire community can feel the effect. The knowledge becomes spatial. The building itself carries it. That is a very effective way for a civilization to make specialized sacred expertise publicly visible without having to explain every technical detail. And yet there is something very human at the core of all this. Ancient Mesopotamians feared what entered in the night. They feared sickness that arrived without warning. They feared unseen malice, unlucky signs, polluted spaces, and the fragile line between safety and exposure. Their answer was not resignation. It was ritual action. It was naming, burying, placing, reciting, purifying, and guarding. The Kusarikku belongs to that answer. It is one of the forms through which a frightened or careful civilization told itself that chaos was not welcome at the door. That phrase is almost enough by itself to explain the entire role of the bullman in sacred defense. Chaos is not welcome at the door, not in the temple, not in the palace, not in the house, not at the gate of the gods, not at the threshold where offerings pass, not where kings are approached, not where families sleep. The Kusarikku stands in that refusal. It is the refusal made visible, and ritual gives that refusal teeth. There's also a reason the bullman would have felt especially appropriate in a defensive ritual world, rather than simply an artistic representation. Ritual is about action under order. It takes materials and places them properly. It speaks words at the right time. It directs force rather than merely admiring it. The Kusarikku, as we have seen, is already a fusion of raw strength and controlled purpose. That makes it almost the ideal guardian for ritual use. It is not wild force, it is appointed force. Sacred defense needs exactly that. When we imagine the bullman in relation to incantations and magical defense, then, we should not picture a loose fantasy creature wandering around the edge of mythology. We should picture a being at work within a system. It stands where protection is needed. It belongs to formal acts of safeguarding. It contributes to the ritual claiming of space. It is part of a strategy that combines word, object, image, and place into one defensive field. That is a far more serious and more interesting role than modern fantasy labels usually allow. It also helps explain why the Kusarikku remained meaningful within a larger world of guardian beings. Mesopotamia did not place all its protective hopes into one form. It used a whole company of defenders, each with its own shape, associations and functions. The bullman was one among several kinds of protective presence, but not interchangeable with them. Its bull strength, human direction and threshold authority gave it a specific place within that broader protective network. It had its own job to do, and that is where the story naturally starts to move next, because once we see the Kusarikku at work inside Mesopotamia's rituals of protection, the bullman no longer stands alone in our imagination. It begins to stand beside other guardians, other hybrid defenders, other beings stationed across the sacred and royal world, which means we are ready to look outward again and place the Kusarikku among its protective companions, to see how it related to the Lamassu and the wider company of guardian powers that watched over Mesopotamia's thresholds. Once the Kusarikku is placed back into the world of ritual defense, it becomes much easier to see that it was never meant to stand alone. Mesopotamia did not rely on a single guardian figure, as if one powerful image could cover every threshold, every building, every unseen danger, and every sacred need from the rivers to the desert edge. It imagined a whole protective world, a populated defensive landscape filled with beings assigned to watch, block, warn, strengthen, purify, and preserve. The Bullman belongs to that larger company, and this is where the subject becomes even more revealing, because the Kusarikku tells us something important about Mesopotamian religion, but it tells us even more when we place it beside the other guardian beings with which it shared space, purpose, and symbolic labour. This is often how the ancient world has to be approached if we want it to make proper sense. Individual figures can seem strange or isolated when viewed on their own. A bullman here, a winged guardian there, a lion-bodied being in another place, and before long the whole thing begins to look like a catalogue of disconnected oddities. But that is usually a problem created by modern distance, not by the ancient culture itself. Mesopotamia did not treat these beings as random entries in a cabinet of curiosities. It understood them as part of a system. The protective world was crowded for a reason. Danger had many forms, sacred spaces had many needs, and power liked to surround itself with more than one kind of defender. That is why the Kusarikku matters most when seen among its companions. The best known of those companions to modern audiences is probably the Lamassu, the great protective being often imagined with the body of a bull or lion, wings and a human head, monumental and watchful, stationed at important entrances with a kind of calm authority that still works remarkably well, even in museum halls far from the cities that first raised such figures. The Lamassu has become famous partly because it is visually unforgettable, and partly because surviving Assyrian examples are so large and commanding that no one can easily pretend not to notice them. The Kusarikku is less famous, less often turned into a shorthand symbol for Mesopotamian grandeur, but it belongs to the same general protective world. And when the two are placed near each other conceptually, the logic of the whole system begins to come into view. The first thing to notice is that Mesopotamia did not appear to believe one guardian shape was enough for every situation. Different beings brought different strengths. The Lamassu, with its composite form and often immense scale, radiated stability, authority, and a sense of overwhelming protective presence. It did not simply stand at a gate. It transformed the gate into an event. It made the approach to a palace or major structure feel supervised by a power that was both majestic and severe. The Kusarikku, by contrast, carries a slightly different emphasis. Its bullman form foregrounds the union of brute force and directed service in a more concentrated way. It is less about serene monumentality and more about threshold strength made immediate. That difference is important because it suggests variety within Mesopotamian protective thinking rather than repetition. The culture was not endlessly stamping out the same guardian in different poses. It was choosing forms carefully, each guardian being answered a slightly different need within the same overall project of defending sacred and royal order. The Lamassu could represent large-scale protective majesty, the kind of overwhelming official power that made a building feel as though it belonged to a world above the ordinary. The Kusarikku could express more pointed threshold force, the kind of guardedness that fits the idea of standing watch with physical readiness. Together, they show a culture able to think in layers even within its own defensive imagery. There is also the wider company of hybrid beings beyond the Lamassu. Mesopotamian art, mythic imagination, and ritual texts contain a whole population of figures that blend animal and human features, or otherwise belong to the category of protective entities rather than ordinary creatures. Some are fierce, some solemn, some strongly tied to royal settings, some to ritual action, some to cosmological ideas, some to specific types of sacred defense. What they share is not uniform appearance, but common function. They exist because the world was thought to require guarding at many points. A civilization that worried about divine boundaries, impure intrusions, hostile spirits, enemy power, curses, and the fragility of order would naturally produce more than one kind of defender. That makes the protective world of Mesopotamia feel almost military in one sense, though not in a narrow modern sense of uniforms and drill. It is more that one can sense a defensive network. Different beings occupy different posts. Some are suited to gates, some to foundations, some to ritual installations, some to temple environments, some to grand royal architecture, some to protective texts and incantatory traditions. No single guardian needs to do everything because the system does not depend on one figure alone. The Kusarikku is part of that network, and its role becomes clearer when we stop asking whether it was the guardian and start seeing it as one guardian among many. This is also why comparison matters. If all Mesopotamian guardians look the same, then their individual symbolism would matter less. But they do not. The variation itself tells us that symbolic bodies were chosen with care. A bull man is not the same as a winged bull with a human head. A lion-bodied guardian is not the same as a bird-human figure. Every composite form gathers qualities differently. The protective world of Mesopotamia is not a mess of creatures. It is a vocabulary. The Kusarikku is one term in that vocabulary, and it says something distinct. It says strength ready for service, threshold force under control, animal power fused directly with human assignment. The Lamassu says something related but not identical. That is what makes the comparison so useful. The Lamassu often conveys a more complete image of cosmicized authority, an all-in-one guardian body combining strength, intelligence, far-reaching watchfulness, and elevated status, especially when monumental in scale. The Kusarikku, by comparison, feels more concentrated and perhaps more direct in its relationship to bodily force. It reminds us that the protective world was not built only to impress, it was built to defend. The bullman does not merely symbolize protection from a distance. It feels like a being positioned closer to the practical edge of sacred space. There is something almost administrative in this variety, and that suits Mesopotamia perfectly. This was a civilization that liked lists, categories, functions, roles, and trained knowledge. It is not surprising that its protective imagination would also become specialized. Just as scribes kept track of offerings, labor, and omens, so too the sacred world seems populated by beings whose roles were not interchangeable. The protective system mirrors the larger society. Important things are assigned, positions are filled, duties distributed. The Kusarikku does not diminish when seen this way. It becomes more clearly itself. It has a job. That job is easier to understand when one remembers how broad the idea of threat was. A palace gate and a temple threshold did not face exactly the same problem, even if both needed guarding. A royal entrance had to declare political strength, control access, and reinforce hierarchy. A temple threshold had to defend sacred purity, divine property, and the seriousness of approach. A household doorway might need quieter protection against illness, misfortune, or intrusive spiritual harm. It makes sense, then, that different guardian beings would cluster around different settings or participate in different levels of the same protective environment. The Kusarikku belongs especially well to the threshold world where force and service meet, while the Lamassu can dominate the monumental approach with a larger aura of state-backed and divinely sanctioned watchfulness. It is also useful to think about how these beings would have felt together. A visitor to an important ancient Mesopotamian space might not have encountered one isolated guardian on a blank stage, but rather a whole architecture of warning and reassurance. Walls, reliefs, symbolic motifs, carvings, guardian figures, ritual protections, and controlled approaches all work together. In that setting, the Kusarikku does not need to carry the entire meaning of the place alone. It contributes to a chorus. It is one voice in a carefully arranged statement that the place is watched, ordered, and not casually open to disruption. That statement mattered not just to outsiders, but to insiders too. priests, officials, workers, servants, and worshippers all lived within a world where important spaces were constantly being marked as defended. That repeated experience shapes the imagination. The more often one sees guardian beings stationed around power, the more natural it becomes to think that power should be visibly guarded. The protective world becomes part of how reality is expected to look. Kingship is not just rule, it is rule with defenders. A god's house is not just a building, it is a building under visible guard. A threshold is not just an opening, it is a controlled crossing. This helps explain why the Mesopotamian protective world can feel both strange and familiar at the same time. The forms are ancient and often startling, but the logic is not hard to grasp. Human beings still surround important things with layers of symbolic and practical defense. We still differentiate between ordinary entrances and restricted ones. We still place signs, emblems, guards, and visual warnings where access matters. We still understand that a place changes when it is watched. Mesopotamia simply rendered that truth in a far more dramatic and mythically confident visual language. And dramatic is not the same as excessive. That point deserves emphasis. The protective beings of Mesopotamia can look extravagant to modernize because we are used to less imaginative architecture. Most modern office buildings appear to have been designed under the strict supervision of accountants who distrusted joy. Ancient Mesopotamia had fewer such inhibitions. It was willing to let a doorway announce itself through beings with horns, wings, human faces, lion bodies, bull strength, and sacred weight. But the extravagance is purposeful. It exists because the culture believed power should look defended in a way everyone could understand immediately. This is where the Kusarikku's place among the guardians becomes especially valuable. It reminds us that not all protectors needed wings or monumental height to matter. Sometimes what mattered was the directness of the body, bull strength, human purpose. A guardian constructed from two of the most legible symbols of force and control. In the company of more elaborate composite beings, the Kusarikku may actually feel refreshingly focused. It is almost stripped down to essentials. It says, here is strength, and here is the will that directs it. That is enough. At the same time, it would be wrong to treat the Kusarikku as a rougher or simpler cousin, beside more famous guardians like the lamassu. Simplicity in symbolic design is not weakness. Often, it is precision. The Kusarikku's form is so effective precisely because it concentrates. It does not scatter meaning across too many traits. It takes the bull and the man and asks what happens when those two are joined for a protective purpose. The answer is a guardian especially suited to defending thresholds and standing within the ritual and sacred machinery of Mesopotamia. The lamassu expands outward, gathering majesty and totalizing presence. The Kusarikku holds the line with muscular clarity. The broader protective world also included beings who were not merely guardians in a friendly sense, but figures whose fearsome appearance was itself part of their usefulness. This matters because Mesopotamian protection was often built on a simple principle. Frightening things can repel other frightening things. The protective being does not need to look gentle to help. In fact, too much gentleness would have been suspiciously unconvincing. A force that can stand against demons, curses, bad spirits, or cosmic disorder should probably look as though it is prepared for an unpleasant conversation. The Kusarikku fits that rule perfectly. It is not a calming decorative presence, it is a deterrent. The lamassu shares some of that deterrent quality, though in a different register. It overwhelms by scale, composure, and grandeur as much as by aggression. The Kusarikku seems more closely tied to the bodily fact of strength. That contrast again suggests why Mesopotamia benefited from having multiple types of guardians. Not every threshold needs the exact same statement. Some need a declaration of royal permanence. Some need a defender shaped for ritual force. Some need the suggestion that the world beyond the gate is already under cosmic supervision. The protective world is varied because the work is varied. There is also a religious richness in this company of guardians. When a culture imagines many protective beings, it is often acknowledging that sacred order is not a simple wall, but a defended territory with many edges. Different beings guard different edges. Some stand near gods, some near kings, some near houses, some near the buried and the dead. Some operate through image, some through incantation, some through both. The Kusarikku belongs to this landscape as one of the figures that made divine and human order feel inhabited by defenders. It helped ensure that the sacred world was not empty space between great gods and small humans, but a structured environment populated by powers assigned to keep things properly arranged. That makes Mesopotamian religion feel less abstract and more lived. One can imagine walking through it. One can imagine approaching a gate under the gaze of one guardian, crossing a threshold protected by another, passing walls that show still more protective imagery, entering a court where access is managed by ritual and hierarchy, and finally arriving in a space where the divine or royal presence is felt through every element of the design. The Kusarikku makes sense there because it belongs to a world where one never quite arrives at the centre without first passing through layers of defence. This layered experience probably shaped how ancient people thought about the relation between power and access. Important things were not supposed to be instantly reachable. One approached them gradually through signs of guardedness. The Guardians taught that lesson. Each one said in its own way that entry is a privilege, that sacredness has edges, that power does not leave itself exposed, and that the route inward is controlled. The Kusarikku joins the Lamassu and other defenders in teaching that same lesson, though with its own particular emphasis on strength under command. It is also possible that the very variety of guardian beings made the protective world feel more convincing. Repetition is powerful, but so is complementarity. A single guardian type repeated endlessly can become familiar to the point of routine. A varied company of defenders suggests a more fully occupied protective order. It feels less like a symbol copied by habit, and more like a genuine host of watchful presences. Mesopotamia seems to have understood this intuitively. Its sacred and royal world was not guarded by one shape alone, it was defended by a company, and perhaps that is the best way to think about it. The Kusarikku belongs to a company of guardians. It has companions, neighbours, parallels, and fellow defenders. It shares the work of protection with the Lamassu and with other beings designed to stand between order and intrusion. Its significance becomes sharper when placed among them because comparison reveals function. The bullman is not merely one more strange creature from an old civilization. It is one carefully chosen answer to the question of what a protector should look like in a world where thresholds mattered intensely, and danger came in more forms than walls alone could resist. Once seen among that company, the Kusarikku begins to feel more grounded and, in a way, more humanly understandable. Not because it becomes ordinary, but because its role becomes clear. It is part of a thoughtful, defensive world, one in which sacred and royal life was surrounded by appropriate beings, each carrying a specific part of the burden. The Lamassu might dominate the grand entrance. Another figure might protect through ritual deposition or incantation. The Kusarikku stands in that same guarded order, bringing its own distinctive power to the work of keeping the line between protected and unprotected space. And as soon as we understand that, another question naturally starts to move forward. If the Kusarikku stood beside other guardians and served within this larger protective world, then what did it finally mean to the people who made and used it? Was it only a practical defender, a sacred servant assigned to a role, or was it also a symbol carrying broader ideas about strength, order, and the sort of force a civilization wanted at its edges? Once the Kusarikku has been placed among the other guardian beings of Mesopotamia, it stops looking like an isolated curiosity and starts looking like something far more deliberate. That is the point where a deeper issue comes into view. A figure like this was not only made to stand at a threshold and look impressive, it also carried meaning. The people who imagined it, carved it, invoked it, and placed it in protective settings were not only solving the practical problem of how to mark a boundary. they were also saying something about power, about service, and about the kind of force a civilization believed should stand at the edge of its sacred and ordered world. The Kusarikku may have looked like a monster to some eyes, like a servant in relation to the gods, and like a symbol to those who read the language of form. The truth is that it may have been all three at once, depending on where one stood and what one feared. That kind of layered meaning is one of the things that makes ancient guardian beings so interesting. Modern habits of thought often push us to sort everything into one category. A figure is either evil or good, either a monster or a protector, either a literal being or a symbol, either part of religion or part of politics. Mesopotamia did not always insist on those clean divisions. It was comfortable with beings that could frighten and defend at the same time. It was comfortable with symbols that were also functional. It was comfortable with servants of divine order who looked unsettling enough to make enemies think twice. The Kusarikku belongs exactly in that world of overlap. Take the word monster, for example. In modern storytelling, monster often means threat. It suggests a being opposed to human life, something chaotic, hostile, or destructive by nature. But ancient protective imagery works by a different logic. A guardian can look monstrous because monstrous force is useful when applied on the right side of the line. A threshold does not always need something gentle. It often needs something alarming. The more dangerous the perceived threat, the more sensible it becomes to station something equally formidable at the entrance. To the right people, the Kusarikku would have appeared protective. To the wrong people, or to the hostile forces it was meant to resist, it would have appeared terrifying. That is not a contradiction. That is successful design. This is one reason modern labels can be misleading. If someone from our world looks at the bullman and says it seems monstrous, that observation is not entirely wrong. The horns, the fusion of human and animal, the bodily force, and the overall refusal to look harmless all push the figure away from comfort and towards intimidation. But the mistake comes when monstrous appearance is taken to mean monstrous purpose. In Mesopotamian sacred logic, frightening beings could defend order. In fact, one could argue that a guardian not frightening enough would have been unconvincing. A dangerous world called for defenders that looked ready to answer danger in its own language. There is also a social truth behind that. People often want the things protecting them to look more formidable than the things threatening them. Nobody feels especially reassured by the sense that their gate is guarded by a figure radiating mild uncertainty. They want confidence. They want force. They want to believe that the line is held by something unpleasant for intruders and dependable for those within. The Kusarikku seems to meet that need perfectly. It does not soften its outline for the sake of public relations. It looks like a being that belongs at a boundary precisely because a boundary is where trouble arrives. So in one sense, yes, the bullman may have been monstrous. Not as a villain, but as a force that borrowed the appearance of danger in order to keep greater danger out. That pattern is older than Mesopotamia and has survived long after it. Cities place lions at gates. Kingdoms adopt eagles, dragons, bulls, and other powerful creatures as signs of rule. Military emblems rarely feature sleepy hedgehogs or apologetic sheep. Cultures reach for fierce forms because fierce forms speak clearly. The Kusarikku belongs to that universal human instinct, but in Mesopotamia it was sharpened by religious seriousness and tied directly to sacred protection. At the same time, the Kusarikku was very clearly not just a monster in the loose sense of a wild, threatening being. It was also a servant, and that may be the more revealing part of its identity. The ancient world of Mesopotamia was built on service at every level. Farmers served the needs of the city, scribes served the administration, priests served the gods, officials served the palace. Human beings themselves, in a broad religious sense, served divine order through offerings, ritual care and obedience to sacred expectation. The cosmos was not imagined as a place where every power floated in isolation. It was arranged through rank and relation. Greater powers had attendants. Important spaces had guardians. Authority was accompanied by proper service. That means the Kusarikku, however fearsome it looked, was not free-floating force. It was assigned force. It stood where it stood because it belonged there. It guarded on behalf of a higher order, whether that order was divine, royal, or both. The servant aspect of the bullman is essential because it transforms raw strength into something stable and trustworthy. An uncontrolled beast can threaten everyone equally. A guardian in service to the gods or to sacred architecture directs its force with purpose. It knows what it protects. It knows where it stands. It is not merely capable of violence, it is capable of loyalty. That last word matters. Loyalty is one of the hidden strengths inside the image of the Kusarikku. The human part of the figure already suggested duty and directed action. When that human quality is joined to the strength of the bull, and placed within the world of divine households, ritual thresholds and guarded palaces, the result is not just power, but reliable power. The Kusarikku is strong in a disciplined way. It does not represent random aggression. It represents aggression appointed to the defense of order. This is why servant is not a lesser category than symbol or protector. In Mesopotamia, service could be honourable and powerful. A servant of divine order was not trivial. A guardian at the gate of the gods was not a decorative extra. It was part of the machinery by which sacred authority became visible and secure. The Kusarikku may not have been a ruling deity seated at the centre of worship, but that does not reduce its status. It gives it a role, and roles matter deeply in Mesopotamian civilization. A world maintained by assigned functions values a being that knows its function and performs it well. In that sense, the bullman may have symbolized one of the civilization's deepest assumptions. Strength is most valuable when placed in service to order. That is a striking idea, and one worth lingering over. Modern culture often admires strength as personal freedom, individual dominance, or raw self-assertion. Mesopotamia appears to have admired a different version of strength, one that was aligned with sacred and political structure. The strongest force was not the one rampaging wherever it pleased. The strongest force was the one standing exactly where it was needed and refusing to move. The Kusarikku embodies that principle. It is strength under appointment. This makes it, quite naturally, a symbol as well. In fact, symbol may be the largest and most useful category of all, provided the word is not misunderstood. In modern speech, calling something a symbol can make it sound less real, as if symbolic meaning were somehow a weak substitute for practical function. But in the Mesopotamian world, symbols were not weak. They were part of how reality was organized. A guardian image did practical work through symbolic force. A ritual object did not stop mattering because it carried meaning. Meaning was the source of its importance. So when the Kusarikku is called a symbol, that should not be heard as a retreat into vagueness. It should be heard as an acknowledgement that the bullman condensed several vital ideas into one recognizable form. It symbolized strength, certainly. That much is obvious from the bull side alone, but it also symbolized controlled access. Its placement at thresholds meant it stood for the principle that not every space is open to everyone and everything. Some places belong to the gods, some belong to kings, some belong to protected households and ordered life. Crossing into such places is not casual. The Kusarikku turns that idea into a body. It says that boundaries are not imaginary lines, they are defended realities. It also symbolized the partnership between human order and animal power. This is one of the most revealing things about hybrid guardians in general. Mesopotamia did not choose mixed forms because it lacked better options. It chose them because mixed forms could say something no single ordinary body could say by itself. The bullman declares that the best guardian is not merely rational and not merely strong, but both. It combines instinctive force with directed purpose. That combination reflects a civilization that lived by converting raw natural conditions into ordered human systems. Rivers had to be channeled. Labour had to be organised. Kingship had to be formalised. Ritual had to be administered. The Guardian mirrors that same act of combination. Nature's force is fused to civilization's discipline. That is a larger symbolic message than it first appears. Mesopotamia lived close to powerful natural realities: flood, storm, drought, animal force, fertile land, destructive water, and the unpredictability of life in a river valley, dependent on careful management. The bull, as a creature of strength and agricultural significance, belonged to that natural world. The human body belonged to the sphere of planning, labour, ritual, law, and city life. The Kusarikku joins them. It could therefore symbolise the triumph not of humanity over nature, but of order over chaos through the proper harnessing of powerful forces. It is not nature destroyed, it is nature conscripted. That may be one reason the figure feels so stable rather than merely violent. The bullman is not a scene of struggle, it is the result of a settlement. Power has been brought into service, force has been assigned a post, the dangerous has become protective without becoming weak. That is the kind of transformation civilizations often dream about because it mirrors what civilization itself is trying to do. It is always trying to turn threat into utility, raw material into structure, expose space into defended space, and uncertainty into order. The Kusarikku is a very old expression of that same project. There is another symbolic layer as well, and it concerns the threshold itself. The bullman is a hybrid, and hybrids are especially suited to boundaries because they are boundaries made flesh. They stand between categories, human and animal, familiar and strange, controlled and dangerous. A threshold is also between categories, outside and inside, public and protected, ordinary and sacred. The Kusarikku, by its very nature, mirrors the place it guards. That makes it symbolically elegant in a way that may not be obvious at first glance. It is not just stationed at a boundary, it is a boundary embodied. This is the kind of thing Mesopotamian symbolic thought did very well. The form of a being was not separate from its function. The body itself could explain the role. That is why the Kusarikku works on more than one level at once. It frightens like a monster, serves like an attendant, and signifies like a carefully composed visual statement. The three roles do not cancel one another out. They reinforce one another. A frightening servant of divine order is a more effective symbol of guardedness than a gentle one. A symbolic figure placed in actual ritual settings becomes more than a simple emblem. A servant with monstrous force says something profound about what order demands at its edges. It may also have meant something about kingship and authority more broadly. In a palace environment, the Kusarikku would not only symbolize divine protection, it would also imply that legitimate rule has defenders appropriate to its seriousness. Ancient power was never content merely to exist. It wanted to be seen as rightful, stable, and dangerous to challenge. A guardian like the bullman helps create exactly that impression. It tells visitors that the authority within is aligned with forces larger than ordinary men. It tells rivals that the entrance is not soft. It tells subjects that the order of the state has teeth. This political symbolism sits comfortably beside the religious one, because Mesopotamia did not draw a hard line between them. Royal order and divine order supported one another. A palace could echo the guarded dignity of a temple. A temple could also function as an economic and civic centre. The Kusarikku, therefore, may have symbolised not just sacred defence or not just political strength, but the entire structure by which civilization kept itself intact. It stood for the principle that what matters most must be visibly defended by powers suitable to its value. To ordinary people, the bullman may also have carried a simpler meaning, one no less important for being simple. It may have meant safety. Not safe in the modern, soft and padded sense, but safe in the hard, ancient sense. Safe because the entrance is watched. Safe because the house of the god is not left exposed. Safe because the palace is guarded. Safe because hostile things are not assumed to be harmless. There is something deeply human in that. Beneath the theology, beneath the symbolism, beneath the art and ritual systems, there remains the basic desire to know that the line between order and danger is being held by something strong enough to hold it. And that may be why figures like the Kusarikku survive so well in memory, even when people forget their specific names. They answer a permanent need. People want to imagine defenders at the edge of important places. They want the door, the wall, the gate, and the sacred precinct to have more than empty space protecting them. The details vary from culture to culture, but the instinct is constant. Mesopotamia gave that instinct a powerful form in the bullman, and once given a form, it could carry meanings far beyond its original moment. There is also a possibility, impossible to prove fully but hard to ignore, that the Kusarikku carried a symbolic lesson about hierarchy itself. Not every strong thing rules. Some strong things guard. Not every impressive being stands at the centre. Some stand at the edge and make the centre possible. That is a very Mesopotamian lesson. The world depends not only on kings and gods, but on attendants, guardians, scribes, workers, and all those whose assigned place sustains the structure. In that sense, the bullman may symbolise not just power, but proper placement. Strength is honourable when it knows where it belongs. That idea gives the figure an almost moral quality. The bullman is not simply frightening for its own sake. It is frightening in the right direction. It does not attack order. It defends it. It does not challenge sacred space. It defines it. It does not rebel against the gods. It stands at their service. That moral orientation is what separates a guardian from a true monster, even if both may look equally unpleasant in silhouette. The Kusarikku may borrow the visual language of danger, but it puts that language to work on behalf of stability. Seen that way, the three labels begin to merge. Monster describes the bullman from the viewpoint of what it opposes. Servant describes it from the viewpoint of the power it serves. Symbol describes it from the viewpoint of the human mind reading its form. All three are accurate, and none is sufficient alone. The Kusarikku is monstrous enough to repel, obedient enough to guard, and meaningful enough to stand for much more than itself. That combination is exactly why it feels like such a successful creation. It is not simple, but it is clear. It tells the ancient world story about force and order in one body, and once a being carries that much meaning, it rarely vanishes completely when the civilization that made it begins to fade. Images with concentrated symbolic power have a habit of outliving the walls they guarded. They move from ritual use into memory, from living belief into carved remains, from temple and palace into tablets, fragments, museums, and later acts of imagination. The Kusarikku may have begun as a guardian within the ordered world of Mesopotamia, but meanings like these do not disappear easily, which is why the next step is to follow the bullman beyond the active life of the ancient cities and see how it survived after the old gates fell quiet, carried forward in clay, stone, record, and memory long after the people who first stationed it at the threshold were gone. Once we begin asking what the Kusarikku meant, another question follows almost automatically. If this bullman mattered so much inside the ancient world, what happened when that world began to change, weaken, break apart, and finally disappear into the long afterlife of ruins, dust, buried walls, broken tablets, and half-forgotten names? Guardian beings are made to stand watch in active places. They belong at doors that still open, courts that still receive visitors, temples that still smell of offerings, and palaces where someone still speaks with authority from within. But Mesopotamia, like every great civilization, did not stay alive forever in the form that created those spaces. Cities fell, dynasties ended, languages shifted, buildings cracked, sacred routines stopped being performed, and yet the Kusarikku did not simply vanish with the last priest or the last king who knew exactly where it stood. It survived, though not in the same way. It survived by moving from active protection into memory, from living ritual into material trace, from sacred presence into the long, patient endurance of clay, stone, image, and record. That is one of the strangest and most moving things about the ancient world. It does not survive whole, it survives in pieces. A wall, but not the roof. A name, but not the voice that once spoke it. A carving, but not the full doorway it guarded. A tablet, but not the hand that pressed the signs into wet clay. A figure, but not the building in which everyone once knew exactly why that figure belonged there. The Kusarikku comes down to us in that fragmentary way. It no longer stands in the same living system of belief and ritual that made it obvious. It reaches us across breakage. And because of that, understanding how it survived means understanding the strange kinds of survival the ancient world allows. The first and most basic part of that survival is material. Mesopotamia was built with clay as much as with anything else. Clay tablets, clay bricks, clay objects, clay seals, clay figurines, clay shaped by hands that expected it to hold thought and power long after the moment of making. There is something almost fitting in that. Clay is humble when wet, ordinary underfoot, and yet once baked or dried and buried in the right conditions, it can outlast whole empires. A king's boast may collapse with the palace wall. A dynasty may become a footnote. But a clay tablet tucked into the earth can wait out centuries with astonishing patience. The same civilization that gave guardians to gates also gave memory to mud. That is a very Mesopotamian kind of miracle. Not the dramatic miracle of a building floating into the sky or a statue speaking at midnight, but the quieter miracle of record surviving where people do not. The Kusarikku endured partly because Mesopotamia was a culture that wrote things down, shaped things into durable forms, and linked sacred imagination to material objects. It did not trust memory alone. It pressed words into tablets. It carved forms into relief. It gave its beings bodies and art, ritual deposits, and visual systems that could survive even after the larger meanings around them began to fade. So when the old world dimmed, the bullman remained here and there in fragments. Not always complete, not always obvious, not always in the form most people would have preferred for easier interpretation. The ancient world is rarely so considerate as to leave neat labels tied to everything with string. More often, it leaves us a broken body, a damaged inscription, a reused stone, or an object found far from the room where it once made perfect sense. This can make survival feel almost accidental. But in another sense, it is not accidental at all. It is the result of how seriously Mesopotamia invested meaning in material. The Kusarikku could survive because it had been made visible and tangible in the first place. That tangible survival matters because memory works differently once ritual stops. In an active temple or guarded palace, the Kusarikku would have been understood through use. People approached it, passed by it, invoked it, placed it, read it within a living protective system. Once that living system is gone, use gives way to evidence. The guardian becomes something later people must interpret. And interpretation is a strange second life. It is not the same as worship. It is not the same as fear. It is not the same as the confident everyday recognition of a person who grew up in a world where hybrid guardians simply belonged. It is a slower, more fragile afterlife, but it is still a kind of life. Think of how many ancient things survive that way. A word in a dead language becomes a subject of study. A figure on a fragment becomes the centre of debate. A ruined threshold becomes enough to suggest a whole building. Memory after civilization is often assembled rather than inherited. The Kusarikku survives, not because an unbroken line of people kept introducing children to the bullman every generation for 4,000 years, but because remnants remained in the earth, in collections, in texts, and eventually in scholarship. It had to be found again. That is a different sort of survival, and in some ways a more dramatic one. There is also something deeply appropriate in the fact that a guardian survived through burial. So much of Mesopotamia's memory went underground. Cities were built, damaged, rebuilt, covered and built over again. Walls sank into mounds. Rooms became layers. Foundations disappeared under the weight of later centuries. Objects placed for protection ended up protected by the very earth that swallowed them. It is almost as if the ancient world packed itself away in clay and dust. Not neatly, not helpfully, but stubbornly enough that later ages would not be able to erase it completely. The Kusarikku, once a defender of thresholds, became itself a thing defended by burial until human curiosity returned to disturb the ground. And curiosity did return, of course. That is part of the bullman's later survival too. Ancient Mesopotamia did not keep itself alive by sitting politely on the surface where everyone could see it. Much of it had to be rediscovered, excavated, deciphered, compared, sorted and argued over by people living in entirely different worlds with entirely different assumptions. Clay tablets had to be read. Fragments had to be identified. Guardian figures had to be placed back into symbolic company. The Kusarikku's modern afterlife therefore depends not only on ancient makers, but on later finders. The chain is broken, but not destroyed. Memory returns in stages. That return is never perfect. A modern scholar, museum visitor, or history enthusiast cannot meet the Kusarikku exactly as an ancient Mesopotamian did. Too much has changed. The sounds of the language are different to us. The temple air is gone. The ritual context has to be reconstructed. The immediate certainty of the symbol has thinned into interpretation. But imperfect memory is not the same as no memory. In fact, one of the remarkable things about ancient Mesopotamia is how much of its protective world can still be felt even through the gaps. A bullman still looks like a guardian. A threshold still looks serious when flanked by force. A hybrid body still tells the mind that categories are being bent for a purpose. Some meanings survive because the human instincts beneath them never entirely disappear. This is one reason ancient guardians continue to grip the imagination long after their original settings are gone. They still work at a basic level. The Kusarikku no longer stands in a temple court where priests know the proper words, but it can still suggest protection. It can still convey that strength has been stationed somewhere important. It can still make the modern viewer pause and think, this was not made to entertain. It was made to guard. That kind of immediate legibility is part of its survival. Not every ancient symbol keeps that quality. Some become so dependent on lost context that only specialists can see them clearly. The bullman, by contrast, still has enough bodily clarity to cross the centuries with some of its force intact. At the same time, survival into memory always changes a thing. The Kusarikku that lived in ritual practice and the Kusarikku that lives in modern imagination are not entirely the same. The ancient figure belonged to a crowded, structured world of gods, thresholds, palace approaches, incantations, and protective systems. The modern figure often lives in books, museum cases, lectures, images online, and the minds of people drawn to the deep past. It has moved from use into study, from participation into representation. That could sound like a loss, and in one sense it is. But it is also a transformation. Ancient beings that survive in memory become available to new forms of attention. People no longer fear them in the same way, but they can think about them, compare them, trace them, and let them open windows into the civilization that made them. That is no small gift. A guardian that survives as evidence becomes a teacher. The Kusarikku now teaches us how Mesopotamia thought about boundaries, strength, service, and sacred defense. It teaches us that hybrid forms were not invented idly. It teaches us that art, ritual and architecture once worked together far more tightly than many modern people assume. It teaches us that civilizations do not only survive through kings' names and battle lists, but through the figures they placed at doors, because doors mattered. In that sense, memory has given the bullman a second duty. It no longer guards the temple. It guards a piece of understanding. There is also the role of museums in this later life, and museums are curious places for guardians to end up. A being once stationed to keep order at a threshold now stands behind glass or under lights, while school groups drift past and someone inevitably says, with great confidence and very little evidence, that they could probably draw that. Museums preserve, but they also relocate. They remove the guardian from its original architecture and place it into the architecture of knowledge. The Kusarikku in such a setting is no longer protecting a god's house or a palace gate. It is participating in a different kind of defense, the defense against forgetting. That may sound grand, but it is true. Museums, archives, and collections do for memory what walls once did for sacred space. They keep fragments from dispersing entirely. They let later generations encounter what would otherwise remain buried or broken beyond recovery. The cost, of course, is that the old setting is lost. A guardian in a gallery is not the same as a guardian at an entrance. But even in dislocation, the figure survives. Its body still speaks. Its materials still testify. Its existence still resists the complete collapse of the world that made it. The same is true of scholarship, which is another odd but necessary afterlife. Ancient guardians become subjects of catalogues, arguments, reconstructions, footnotes, and careful comparisons. This can sound dry, and sometimes it is. There are certainly moments when one imagines the bullman, originally created to guard sacred thresholds, looking down at modern academic debates and thinking that this is not at all how he expected eternity to go. But scholarship matters because it rebuilds context. It takes the scattered evidence and tries to reassemble the protective world around it. It asks where the figure appeared, how it functioned, how it related to other beings, and what its symbolic logic may have been. Without that work, survival would remain mute. The Kusarikku would endure physically but speak much less clearly. And then there is the broader imagination. Ancient Mesopotamian beings have a way of returning not only through academic study, but through fascination. People encounter them and become curious. They appear in documentaries, articles, illustrations, speculative history, and the wider cultural hunger for lost worlds. Sometimes that process is careful, sometimes it is gloriously inaccurate. The ancient world is often forced to endure all sorts of modern nonsense along the way. But even that, in its own untidy fashion, is a sign of survival. A forgotten figure attracts no myths, no reconstructions, no interest at all. The Kusarikku still draws the eye because it carries a kind of durable magnetism. It belongs to that category of ancient forms that seem to contain more world than first appears. There is something touching in that. A being once made to guard order at the edge of sacred and royal life now survives at the edge of modern memory, still managing to hold attention. It no longer frightens demons, perhaps, though one should never be too certain about museum basements after dark. But it does keep the past from becoming entirely flat. It reminds us that Mesopotamia was not just a list of cities and kings. It was a visual civilization full of defended meanings. It was a world where doors mattered enough to place bullmen beside them. The survival of the Kusarikku keeps that world textured. It also keeps alive the idea that ancient people were not naive image makers fumbling toward meaning by accident. The bullman's endurance shows the opposite. It shows intelligence and symbolic design. It shows a civilization able to concentrate ideas into form so effectively that even after the collapse of its institutions, enough of the meaning can still be sensed. Clay survives. Stone survives. But design survives too if it is strong enough. The Kusarikku survives because it was well imagined. There is another layer to this survival, and that is emotional rather than material. Certain ancient figures linger because they answer permanent human concerns. The Kusarikku answered one of the oldest concerns of all. How do we protect what matters? That question does not disappear when a civilization ends. Every age asks it in new ways. Every age marks its own thresholds. Every age surrounds important places with guards, symbols, emblems, and warnings. The materials change, the beliefs change, the architecture changes, but the underlying need remains. That is why the bullman can still feel strangely understandable. We may not share the full theology of ancient Mesopotamia, but we understand wanting strong things at vulnerable edges. That shared instinct gives the Kusarikku a kind of emotional afterlife. It no longer belongs to our religious system, yet it can still be read because the fear it answered is familiar. Doors still matter, boundaries still matter. Sacred or meaningful spaces still feel different when they are visibly defended. That does not make the bullman modern. It makes it enduringly human in the problem it addresses. The old form continues to live because the old question continues to live. And perhaps that is the deepest form of memory, deeper even than clay and stone. Material objects survive in museums and storerooms, yes, but the ideas inside them survive in recognition. When we look at the Kusarikku and understand, even dimly, that this being belongs to the defense of order, we are participating in its survival. Not perfectly, not as the ancients did, but enough. The figure does not have to become fully modern to remain meaningful. It only has to keep that spark of legibility alive across time. Of course, memory can also distort. Ancient beings are often simplified as they travel forward. A rich guardian figure becomes a bullman monster in a quick summary. A protective system becomes mythology in the shallow sense. A sacred symbol becomes an aesthetic motif stripped of use. This happens to nearly every old civilization. The later world remembers unevenly. But even distorted memory can preserve a trace worth following. A simplified bullman still invites the curious person to ask what the original meaning was. A museum label can become the start of deeper study. A fragment can lead back toward a whole world view. Survival does not have to be perfect to be powerful. So the Kusarikku comes to us now in a mixed state. Part artifact, part reconstruction, part symbol, part subject of study, part surviving pulse from a very old protective imagination. It has crossed from clay to memory, from threshold to archive, from active guardian to preserved witness. It no longer guards the same doors, but it guards something else. It guards a portion of Mesopotamia's complexity against easy forgetting. It keeps alive the fact that ancient civilization thought seriously about strength, service, ritual, architecture, and the visible defense of important space. That is not a small survival. Many things vanish more completely than that. Whole languages disappear without enough trace to recover. Whole rituals leave no record. Whole buildings become anonymous mounds. The Kusarikku, by contrast, remained enough of itself that we can still follow it back into the world that made it. We can still see the bull and the man. We can still sense the threshold. We can still understand that the ancient imagination placed this being where boundaries mattered most. Across thousands of years, through burial, ruin, excavation, storage, study and retelling, that central truth has not been entirely lost. And once a figure survives that well, it begins to do more than merely endure. It begins to ask for one final look. Not at the details of placement or the mechanics of ritual, but at the larger feeling left behind by all of it. Because after following the Kusarikku through symbolism, thresholds, gods, rituals, companion guardians, and long survival into memory, what remains is not just an old bull man from a distant world, but a very old answer to a human desire that has never quite gone away. The desire to believe that somewhere at the edge of what matters, something strong is still standing watch. By the time we arrive here, after following the Kusarikku through temple thresholds, palace approaches, protective rituals, divine households, carved images, and long survival in clay and memory, the bullman begins to feel less like a strange ancient creature and more like a very old idea wearing a very specific body. That is perhaps the quietest and most useful thought to take with us now. The Kusarikku is not only a figure from Mesopotamia, it is also a way of thinking about what should stand at the edge of what matters. Ancient people did not build lives without boundaries. They could not afford to. A field had edges, a city had walls, a temple had a gate, a king had guarded rooms, A house had a door that separated those within from everything beyond. And the world beyond was not imagined as harmless. It held weather, strangers, illness, bad luck, envy, violence, disorder, and the 1,000 other things that could turn an ordinary day into a difficult one. Mesopotamia responded to that fact with remarkable seriousness. It did not pretend that important places would somehow stay safe by accident. It defended them with architecture, ritual, symbolism, and memory. The Kusarikku stood within that response. It was one of the forms given to the hope that strength could be posted where vulnerability began. That is why the bullman still lingers in the mind so easily. Even after all the cities that knew it best have fallen silent, the basic feeling behind it remains familiar. Human beings still care about thresholds. We still notice doors. We still mark the spaces that matter more than others. We still distinguish between what is open to everyone and what is not. A child's bedroom feels different from a street. A courthouse feels different from a shop. A family home feels different from a station platform. A grave feels different from a marketplace. A sacred place still asks something of the body before one enters, even for people who no longer describe that feeling in ancient religious terms. Thresholds continue to matter, because crossing them changes what sort of world one is in. The Kusarikku belonged to that very practical truth. It was not a creature invented only to make mythology more colourful. It was a guardian shaped for the places where one kind of space became another. Outside gave way to inside. Ordinary life gave way to sacred order. Exposure gave way to protected ground. A being that was itself mixed, part bull and part man, was well suited to stand at a point that was also mixed, part one realm and part another. The ancient world liked that kind of symbolic precision. It wanted the body of the guardian to fit the work of the guardian, and the work in this case was simple enough to say plainly, hold the line, keep disorder out, make the entrance feel guarded, let those who approach understand that something valuable begins here. There is comfort in that, and not only ancient comfort. Even modern life, for all its screens and schedules and very confident little electronic buzzers, still depends on the same instinct. We lock our doors, we install cameras, we put lights near entrances, we hang signs, we choose symbols, we worry about who and what comes into our homes. We care very much whether a place feels secure. We may not place horned guardians at the front gate, though apartment buildings would certainly become easier to find if someone did. But the instinct has not changed. We still want protection to be visible. We still like the sense that something is watching the edge. That may be why old guardian figures keep returning in human imagination. The details shift from age to age, but the need survives. Some cultures place lions at doors, some place dragons on roofs. Some use saints, angels, inscriptions, blessings, family symbols or national emblems. Some rely almost entirely on technology and steel, yet even then the desire remains to make protection felt and not merely assumed. People sleep better when the boundary seems held. The Kusarikku answered that desire in Mesopotamia with unusual directness. It did not try to look charming. It did not pretend that the world was softer than it was. It stood there as if to say that safety requires strength, and that strength should know where to stand. That is probably one reason the figure feels so grounded despite its strangeness. The body is unusual, yes. The hybrid form catches the eye. But the emotional logic is straightforward. A bull brings force. A man brings purpose. Together they make a guardian. There is almost no wasted motion in the symbolism. It is practical imagination. A civilization looked at the problem of vulnerable thresholds and answered with a body built for the job. In that sense, the Kusarikku is not just ancient fantasy, it is ancient design. And perhaps that is another quiet thought worth keeping. Ancient civilizations were not vague dreamers fumbling in the dark toward meaning. They were often extremely sharp about meaning. Mesopotamia in particular was very good at assigning roles, naming things, building systems, and placing symbols where symbols would do the most work. The Kusarikku shows that intelligence clearly. It was not made at random. It was made because a threshold needed a being that expressed both danger and discipline. The result was something memorable enough to survive the collapse of the world that first understood it. That survival says a great deal too. Most things disappear. A voice disappears. A ritual performance disappears. A living glance from priest to supplicant disappears. A smell, a season, a moment of fear at a temple gate, all of that is gone. But certain forms remain because they were made well, repeated often, and attached to deep human concerns. The bullman survived because the people who imagined it knew what they were doing. They tied a guardian to one of the oldest human needs, the need to believe that what matters is not left undefended. Clay preserved the image, stone preserved the outline, text preserved the world around it just enough that later ages could still recognise what sort of work the figure once did. And once recognised, the old meaning begins to live again, not exactly as it once lived, but enough. Enough for a museum visitor to pause. Enough for a historian to reconstruct a protective system. Enough for a person lying awake at night, listening to a story from the deep past, to understand why a civilization would want a bull man at the edge of sacred space. That is no small afterlife. There is something else that becomes clear when we sit with the Kusarikku for a while. It teaches a rather firm lesson about strength. Modern cultures often admire strength in noisy ways. Strength becomes display, domination, personal image, or the ability to push one's will across the room. The Kusarikku represents a quieter, and in some ways stricter idea. Strength matters most when it serves. It stands at a post. It protects something beyond itself. It does not wander off to seek applause. It does not demand to become the centre of the world. It remains where it is needed. That is a very old lesson, and a useful one. The strongest guardian is not the one that boasts. It is the one that remains at the threshold and does not fail. Mesopotamia understood that because Mesopotamia depended on things staying in place. Rivers needed channels, fields needed order, temples needed offerings, kings needed legitimacy, walls needed repair, households needed continuity. A civilization living so close to instability tends to develop respect for whatever holds. The bullman is one expression of that respect. It is a being made to hold the line, to hold the threshold, to hold back what should not enter. And for people living in a world where so much could go wrong, that image must have carried real reassurance. Not soft reassurance, certainly. The Kusarikku is not warm in the modern sentimental sense. It does not look like something one would hug after a difficult day, unless one wished to have a much more difficult day. But not all reassurance is gentle. Some reassurance comes from knowing that whatever stands guard is more severe than whatever threatens the door. That type of reassurance is ancient, honest, and still quite understandable. When the world feels uncertain, people do not only want kindness, they also want competence. The Kusarikku radiates competence in the old sacred language of horns, strength, and watchfulness. It also says something about order itself. Order is often imagined now as paperwork, routine, or rules written by people who enjoy colour-coding folders. Ancient order was that sometimes too, especially in a civilization as administrative as Mesopotamia, but it was also larger and more urgent. Order meant fields watered correctly, rituals performed properly, kingship held within accepted structures, enemies kept beyond the wall, sickness driven from the house, offerings delivered, boundaries respected, and the gods not carelessly offended. It was the condition under which life could continue without collapsing into fear and shortage. A guardian at the threshold therefore protected more than a room. It protected the arrangement that made civilized life possible. That may be the deepest reason the Kusarikku still feels substantial, rather than decorative. It belongs to a serious view of life, a view in which doors matter, boundaries matter, service matters, sacredness matters, and force must be disciplined if it is to be useful. The bullman embodies all of that without needing to say a word. It simply stands there and lets the body make the argument. And the argument is still readable. There are, of course, limits to how much we can recover. No one now can stand before the Kusarikku in exactly the same way a Mesopotamian priest, official, labourer or worshipper did. Too much context is gone. The old sounds, gestures, daily assumptions and exact feelings of approach belong to a vanished world. We should be honest about that. Ancient things are never fully restored by modern imagination. But honesty about the lost does not mean the connection is broken. It only means the connection is partial. We do not know everything, but we know enough to feel the outline of the thought. A protected threshold should look protected. A god's house should not appear open to whatever drifts in from the street. A king's gate should say something before the king is ever seen. And a force suited to that work should look more than human, because ordinary limits do not make especially convincing guardians. The Kusarikku answered those needs with admirable clarity. It made sacred defence visible. It turned the idea of guardedness into a body. It gave ancient architecture a way to announce that the line between outside and inside was being watched by something with horns, weight, and purpose. Even now, stripped of its original walls and ritual setting, that logic survives. One can still understand why this figure belonged where it did. One can still sense that it was made for the edge, not the centre. For the entrance, not the throne. For the boundary, not the field beyond. And perhaps there is something quietly moving about that role. Many of the greatest things in human life are protected by figures, people, habits, or systems that do not stand at the centre of attention. The threshold matters because it is where exposure begins, and those who guard thresholds rarely receive the same admiration as those who sit in the inner room. Yet without them, the inner room is far more vulnerable. The Kusarikku belongs to that old truth as well. It is impressive, certainly, but it is impressive in service. Its strength is honourable, because it is placed between danger and what should be kept intact. That idea has not grown old. Homes still need watching. Sacred things still feel different at their edges. Important spaces still change the body as one approaches. People still want to feel that the line is held by something stronger than accident. And so the bullman remains understandable. Not because modern people share every detail of Mesopotamian belief, but because the human need behind the symbol continues to exist. We still want guardians. We still build them in whatever language our age can manage. Sometimes that language is stone and ritual. Sometimes it is steel and software. Sometimes it is memory itself, the act of carrying forward an old image because it says something true about what people fear losing. The Kusarikku has become part of that memory now. It no longer stands at a living gate in Uruk or Assyria or Babylon, with priests moving past and offerings being brought in, but it stands elsewhere. It stands in the recovered imagination of the ancient Near East. It stands in museums, in books, in study, in fragments of carved form, in the mind of anyone who has followed it patiently through its world. It stands wherever the old thought becomes visible again. The thought that strength should be stationed at vulnerable edges and that what is sacred, ordered, or beloved should not be left unwatched. That may be enough for tonight. Not a final answer, because the ancient world rarely gives those. More a steady thought to let settle in the room. Somewhere in the deep past, people once built doors and walls and sacred spaces, and when they asked themselves what should stand there at the line between safety and uncertainty, they imagined the Kusarikku, a bullman, strong, watchful, severe, and assigned to the threshold. And even now, long after the cities that knew it best have gone quiet, one can still feel why they did it, why they wanted that shape at the entrance, and why the image remains standing a little longer in the mind, as the old gate stays guarded and the night grows still around it.